All right, everyone, so we should get started. Welcome to this event on political epistemology. For those of you who don't know, I'm Michael Hannon. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Institute for Philosophy and also one of the co-organizers of this event along with Robin McKenna up here. So for those of you who don't know, it seems somewhat fitting that this event is held here because the Senate House was once the home of the Ministry of Information during the Second World War, and George Orwell's wife actually worked in the Department of Censorship here, and that inspired his description of the Ministry of Truth in 1984. So there's that bit of fun background about contextualizing this event a bit. So
wasn't this building used in the film?
It might have been.
I think this building was used in the film.
Yeah, it was also used in Batman.
You should have been leading with that.
Yeah, the ballroom scene in particular. Anyway, so as recent events around the world have illustrated, our political culture is increasingly characterized by deep disagreements, by ignoring the details of policy, and by appeals to emotion. Further, it seems like the clash of political outlooks threatens the common ground on which the collective pursuit of truth depends. So it seems crucial in this particular context that we bring together these foundational discussions of truth, knowledge, pluralism, democracy, deep disagreements, and so forth. So this is the conference is titled Political Epistemology. I think this is a fairly new term. It has been used a bit recently in the academic lexicon. But of course, the interest in the intersection of political philosophy and epistemology goes way back, at least until Plato. There we go.
I was at 1970.
I started slow. All right. Okay. So the main goal of this conference is to bring together people working in political philosophy and epistemology to explore the ways in which political philosophers can learn from epistemologists and that epistemologists can learn from political philosophers, as well as find constructive paths forward working together. Another goal of this event actually is to start building something of a broader network in the area of political epistemology. So we view this as a kind of kickoff event for that. So if you're interested, for instance, a couple things that will be going on here in the Institute of Philosophy at Senate House in the fall are things like we'll have a fortnightly seminar series titled New Directions in Political Epistemology. We're also hoping to produce a podcast series on the role of truth in politics, as well as some other things. So if you're interested in sorts of events that are related to this that are on the horizon, feel free to find me over coffee, and I'm happy to tell you more about that. Just briefly in terms of logistics, so I was going to announce the fire alarm, but you've heard that. Robin and I will be chairing each session, and we're going to do the hand sort of finger system. So for those of you who don't know, hand is a new question, finger is a follow-up on an existing point. There are a fair number of people here, so try and exercise some self-restraint and don't do things like, I have 3 questions and 4 follow-ups or 3 comments and this question comes in 8 parts, that sort of thing. And finally, just a few words of thanks. So this event wouldn't have been possible without the generous support from multiple organizations. So that includes the British Academy, the Society for Applied Philosophy, the Mind Association, the Aristotelian Society, and the Institute for Philosophy. So Robin and I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of them for their support. I'd also like to thank Robin for first getting in touch about organizing this event, and also for all of his help organizing it since he's initially got in touch about putting something like this on. And finally, to thank all of you for being here, the speakers, the commentators, the audience. We're delighted to see this come together, and we hope you find the event engaging and worthwhile. And so without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Professor Robert Jalise from Vanderbilt University, who's going to tell us about the real problem of polarization.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to try to move quickly. Thanks for organizing this, that the American Political Science Association now has a category called political epistemology. I think is a very positive indicator, and it would be good to see philosophers get involved more directly in epistemic issues about politics. So I'm going to start with some background first and then get into talking about polarization. So I suspect some of you in the room know some of the work that I've done in the past. I've tried to develop an epistemic conception of democracy that I like to think of as more Deweyan and Peircean pragmatic than other versions of the view for this reason. I think that there are epistemic considerations that speak in favor of democracy that aren't attached to claims about the epistemic value of democratic outcomes, and also aren't attached to claims about the epistemic benefits that accrue to democratic participants. That is, within the epistemic democracy literature, there's often sort of a split between the outcomes people, the people who think the epistemic goods of democracy exist in their outcomes, and the people who think that participating as a democratic citizen makes you a more rational ranker of your preferences, or a more informed thinker, or in some cases more knowledgeable. It's not that I would deny either of those claims. I just think that there's a distinctive kind of epistemic good that democracy involves, that has to do more with our epistemic aspirations than anything having to do with outcomes or the building of our epistemic capacities. That is, the view I've tried to develop tries to suggest that, with Dewey, that democracy is the sort of political face of certain epistemic aspirations and norms that we accept in non-political contexts. That is, to put it in a slogan, I think the ethics of belief lends support to the ethos of democracy. And I think that that approach has some benefits. One, in that it's non-rivalrous with other sites of epistemic benefit that democracy might be claimed to have. But also, secondly, the view doesn't require one to be optimistic about the epistemic value of democratic outcomes or the epistemic effects on the intellectual character of democratic participants. The view that says that democracy is sort of the political face of our epistemic ambitions, it allows one to say that democracy can have a pretty shabby epistemic record with respect to its outcomes, and is willing to take on board and think through the pretty depressing data about public ignorance and public irrationality on politics. What I think is another benefit of the thought that part of the epistemic story of democracy is a story about our epistemic ambitions and aspirations, is that that approach enables us, I think, to recognize and diagnose certain epistemic dysfunctions in democratic practice in a way that I think eludes other epistemic accounts. And it might even help us to locate or identify certain forms of political epistemic pathology that aren't easily accessed by the views that tend to focus on the epistemic value of the outputs or the epistemic benefits to the participating citizen. And I think that part of what's on the agenda for today's talk, which is the real problem with polarization, is an attempt to make good on that claim. I think that there's a dimension of the polarization phenomenon that we have reason to think, independently of our views in democratic theory, is troubling for democracy. And I think that the idea of focusing on the epistemic benefits of democracy from the point of view of our epistemic aspirations helps us to see see a face of what's troubling about some of the polarization data. So that's just some background. We could talk about any of that if you want in the Q&A. So I think it's safe to say that most of us here find polarization troubling. We're going to talk about what exactly polarization is in a minute. And what I'm interested in doing in this talk is trying to give an explanation of what's perhaps most troubling, or what the sort of core of the trouble is for democracy in polarization. And then something a little bit more speculative. I want to propose what I think is a non-standard and hopefully not too crazy sounding, but I need some help in making it sound less crazy, reaction or response to polarization. I want to proceed in 3 steps. First is to distinguish 2 senses of polarization, both of which I think will be familiar, but I think most of the people in the room will also recognize that these 2 senses are often conflated, at least in the political vernacular and in popular discourse. Then I want to introduce what I call the polarization dynamic and try to suggest that some recent empirical findings about the phenomenon, sometimes called group polarization, shows that that phenomenon actually involves effects that have to do not simply with the believer's shifts in the believer's doxastic content, right? Not only in the sort of making each believer a more extreme version of his prior self, but the belief polarization or group polarization phenomenon also has also impacts the way individuals see their political opposition. So it not only involves your beliefs, but also involves your beliefs about the people who believe things that are different from what you believe. And then I want to say that a common instinct among political philosophers to address that aspect of polarization, which roughly is the instinct to say, well, with Dewey and Jane Addams, that the cure for the ills of democracy is more and better democracy. I want to suggest that maybe we need to rethink that thought, and maybe there is a sense in which sometimes democracy suffers from a certain kind of pathology, in which the right response is to do less democracy, and I'm going to try to make that sound less heretical to you. I'm not Jason Brennan, I promise. So sometimes more democracy isn't the cure, and sometimes maybe we need less democracy. That's going to be the part I want some help with. That is to try to make that a plausible view and not sound like Jason Brennan. All right. So laments over polarization, or something that's called polarization, are common. If you watch any of the news programs at night, you will often, Anderson Cooper will talk about it. And so it's important to distinguish, though, two senses, and again, I think this is familiar. I want to distinguish between political polarization and what, for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to call belief polarization. Belief polarization is roughly the phenomenon that's perhaps more commonly known as group polarization, but I think the term group polarization is misleading in all kinds of ways and makes the distinction between, or the distinction that I want to draw a little bit harder to keep in place. So, political polarization is the phenomenon of the dropping out of the middle ground between ideologically opposed political groups. Political polarization is a diagnosis that has to do with the, we might say, ideological distance between political opponents. It characterizes a political situation in which because the common ground has dropped out, or because there's nobody occupying more moderate positions, the opposed groups have little, if any, basis for cooperation. Any attempt to cooperate will look to one's compatriots as a kind of capitulation, and opposed groups find little basis for even productive conversation. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why political polarization is something to be troubled by. After all, democracy has to get things done if it's to succeed, and it looks as if political polarization is results in, we might say, deadlock and stagnation and paralysis. Now, to be sure, there's disagreement among people who study these things about whether, in the States at least, whether the populace is indeed polarized in this way. Some people say, of course they are, look. Others say, well, the politicians are polarized, they are deeply ideological partisans, but when you actually poll democratic citizens in the States, you'll find that there's a lot more common ground than people tend to realize or give credit for. Not going to get involved in that debate, although I do have a side in that debate. I think that the populace is indeed polarized. But no matter where you stand on that, polarization in this political sense looks like it's, at least in one obvious sense, bad for democracy. We've got to get things done. Cooperation and coordination are necessary in order to get things done, and excessive partisanship, especially of the dogmatic kind, looks like this. It's sort of an anti-democratic tendency to think that politics is a matter of choosing platforms and digging in one's heels. To be sure, though, there are some views of democracy that think political polarization, at least to a certain degree, isn't necessarily such a bad thing. Certain agonistic and interest group-based pluralist views seem to be willing to allow that a certain level of deadlock might actually be healthy. Some read Tocqueville and Madison as recommending this kind of view. We needn't get into that either. Contrast, though, political polarization with the phenomenon that I'm concerned with, and that I think most of you are familiar with as well, what's called group polarization, but again, I'm going to call belief polarization in this talk. Belief polarization is not a diagnosis or a measure of or a description of the distance between two ideologically opposed groups. Belief polarization is a phenomenon that occurs within a like-minded political group. And it's a measure not of the distance between opponents, but it's a measure of the doxastic content distance between what individuals believe before they start talking at some length with like-minded others, and after they talk with like-minded others. And the phenomenon, which again I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is pretty robust. We're all vulnerable to it. It's been studied in all kinds of contexts, and not just political ones. It's the phenomenon according to which discussion among like-minded others tends to lead each party to that discussion to adopt a more extreme version of the belief with which he or she began. And let's make one thing clear. It looks like the phenomenon not only affects degree of belief, it does, right? It looks like you become your creedal level goes up. It looks like you become more confident the longer you talk to like-minded others. But it also affects the content. Just to cite, again, you know, if you've read anything by Cass Sunstein in the past 15, 20 years, you probably know all about this stuff. If you buy one Cass Sunstein book this year,
it's all the same.
So, you know, one of the examples that Sunstein uses a lot, and it looks like it's pretty robust, has to do with juries, convicting jury. The longer the jury that agrees that the guy is guilty talks, the more severe they're willing to recommend, the more severe punishment they're willing to recommend, even if they started where there was a fairly run-of-the-mill, what you might expect, distribution of, you know, people thinking that a person should be sort of punished according to what's usually given, maybe a little bit more severe, maybe a little bit more lenient. The longer they talk, the more they come to shift towards each person holding the view that the convicted person ought to get a more severe punishment than the one that he or she began thinking was warranted. What's, I think, sort of frightening from the point of view maybe of us philosophers about the phenomenon is it doesn't seem that belief polarization is driven by the introduction of new reasons or better arguments or more information. It looks as if the belief polarization phenomenon is the engine of it, we might say. The engine of belief polarization is social dynamics of various kinds, in-group and out-group pressures, the pressures to conform, certain kinds of biases. It's like in these contexts we become sort of early teenagers. We don't want to look like posers, so we sort of want to go along with the guy who's in the group who's saying the most extreme things so that nobody thinks that we're inauthentic in our membership in the group. And that looks, again, from the point of view of philosophers, that looks troubling. But maybe at the end of the day, belief polarization is more of a mixed bag than we might think. You might say, well, look, one nifty thing about the phenomenon is that the very fact that it exists gives philosophers who are interested in sort of deliberative and participatory conceptions of democracy something to say back to the guy who says, hey, participation and deliberation are really great if you're trying to figure out what to think, but once you know what to think, why talk to anybody else? You've already figured it out. Just go and press your view as hard as you can and don't listen to any critics. The phenomenon gives you some pushback to that view. You say, well, if you want to hold on to the truth, you have to engage others, right? Because it looks as if a strategy of non-engagement is not a good way to sustain your belief, which we'll just assume whatever it is that you believe right now is true. If you don't, it's sort of like a Millian argument almost, right? If you don't sort of experience the clash of your truth with everyone else's falsehood, not only does it become a dead dogma, but it becomes a dead dogma in the way that the content shifts, and so you lose the truth. That's nifty. One thing that's maybe sort of less, well, one thing that renders the belief polarization phenomenon sort of maybe more like a mixed bag for democracy, especially those of us who hold participatory deliberativist views, has to do with some findings by political scientist Diana Mutz. It's interesting that this gets so little uptake in the deliberative democracy literature, by the way. So Mutz finds that what she calls heterogeneous deliberation, right? The kind of deliberation that, or what deliberative Democrats call deliberation, right? The kind of engagement in the space of reasons with people with whom one disagrees is positively correlated with the disinclination to participate. That is, the deliberative Democrats' conception of deliberation seems to positively correlate with non-political participation, and put it the other way around, homogeneous interaction politically, that is, political interaction with people who are more or less just like you, looks like it's positively correlated with participation. You're more likely to vote, for example, the more time you spend talking with the people with whom you agree. So if you've got a certain view about the value of participation, or alternatively, if you've got even an epistemic view about deliberative democracy, according to which numbers matter in a particular way, so certain kinds of Condorcetian views, you might sort of wind up with this weird sort of paradox in thought, right? Yeah, deliberation looks like it's bad for democracy because it inhibits participation. If the numbers are what matters, or if participation as such is what matters, it looks as if more homogeneous engagement is probably better for democracy. So maybe the belief polarization phenomenon isn't so much a warning about democracy as it is a reductio of a certain sort of popular view in democratic theory. You might also wonder, like, maybe belief polarization isn't such a threat to democracy because after all, and Christopher knows this well, right? He has written a fun, really fantastic book about this. Political beliefs are subject to all kinds of irrational influences, right? It's not as if, but for the belief polarization phenomenon, we would be good political thinkers. And so what makes belief polarization so special, that it's a special kind of threat or something in particular to worry about? So it might look like belief polarization, by which now I just mean that phenomenon which homogeneous political engagement seems to involve a shift towards more extreme versions of people's pre-deliberative beliefs. Itself might not be clear what exactly the lesson is for democratic theory if that were the full story. But it's not the full story. There's more to the phenomenon of belief polarization, and I think that once you spell out some of these sort of correlate effects, the threat of belief polarization to democracy becomes easier to grasp, and maybe the threat actually becomes a little bit more severe than we might have thought. So I want to draw on some recent sort of empirical stuff, and a lot of which, by the way, is coming from a political scientist and political psychologist named Shanto Iyengar, and sort of draw out some implications of some of these findings. One of the places where I think philosophers and the political scientists should be trying to forge more interaction is in this area, because the political scientists who are interested in group belief polarization are often not subtle in their epistemology, to put it one way. So sometimes when they're organizing their studies or drawing the conclusions out of their data, sometimes they're overlooking really important distinctions that are sort of first week epistemology sort of distinctions. By the way, you see this, I think, most strongly in the public ignorance literature that's often done by political scientists and sociologists. They're making claims about ignorance, and it's very hard, very rare does one find in any of that data the people reporting the data, gathering the data, making the distinction between false belief and unjustified belief, for example. And once you see that, there's obviously a distinction there, and it matters, right? What we mean by ignorance in this case, it matters. Not all false believing is ignorant believing, right? You start saying, well, look, the picture has to be complicated a little bit, or has to be complicated quite a bit in order to make sense of exactly what the phenomenon is and what the threat is. And then when you see, like, well, you count as ignorant in this literature if, you don't know, you can't name the 3 branches of government. Because you can't name any of them, you're ignorant. If you can only name 2 of them, you're in the same condition. If you can name 3, but you're mistaken about what one is, you're in the same condition, right? You say, well, no, these are, maybe somebody just needs a reminder. Is that ignorance? No, not exactly. It's not ignorance in the same sense as the person who says, there are branches of government? What are they, right? What's that, right? That looks like that's ignorant in a way that's different. But in this literature, those discriminations aren't met. And one can see why, by the way. It's very hard to design nifty studies that can deliver quantifiable, bankable data if you introduce too much nuance into the epistemic story about what ignorance is all about. Similar thing, I think, is happening, though maybe a little bit less pernicious, because the people who investigate group polarization are often people who are on the Democrat side, unlike the people who investigate public ignorance are often, well, some of whom are not on the Democrat side. So it's not as pernicious, but it does look like it's suffering from a kind of insufficiently robust conception of the epistemic issues, let's say. So one of the nice things, though, about the data is that I'm not myself an advocate of strictly armchair philosophy, but this is a case in which some of the data suggest or enable the armchair epistemologist, the philosopher, to sort of spell out a story given certain epistemic input. You see some of the new data, you can start seeing your way towards what kinds of mechanisms might be at work, and some political scientist needs to step forward and agree to talk to some philosophers about how to design new studies that could confirm or disconfirm or modify the kind of story I'm going to try to put together. All right. So the claim is that the trouble with belief polarization is that it is the tip of an iceberg. It sets into motion a much broader, far-reaching dynamic of what I'll call just epistemic dysfunction. And I'm just going to call this the polarization dynamic. And I'm just going to run through some very quick sort of stuff about the empirics. If you want the citations, talk to me afterwards. I've got them with me. As I mentioned at the beginning, belief polarization is an effect, is a phenomenon that impacts not only the content of one's belief, it's not only the shift to the more extreme version of your prior belief, and it doesn't only affect the creedal level, the degree of belief, it's not only the effect of becoming more confident, it also impacts your assessment of opposing beliefs and your estimation of the people who are proponents of those opposing beliefs. That is, we might say, belief polarization has a second and third personal face to it. Polarized people come to adopt, in predictable ways, certain attitudes and beliefs about others, namely the people with whom they disagree. So here's a picture. Once belief polarization has set in, it looks as if not only does the belief polarized person come to adopt a more extreme version of his view, the belief polarized person also becomes more inclined to ascribe to his political opponents only the extreme version of the opponent's view, right? That is, the belief polarized person comes to increasingly be unable to see nuance in the opposing side. The opposing side becomes, for him, the polarized person, doxastically homogeneous. They become a sort of monolith of opposition, and the opposition is centered around only the most extreme version of the opposing view. In the States, by the way, those of you who are following things in the States, this is easy to see in the gun control debate. Any statement, hey, look, we need to do something about all the guns, gets heard, right? I don't think it's merely just opportunistically interpreted as, well, sometimes it obviously is. I think people hear you saying, when you say, we need to do something about this, as, I'm taking your guns away, right? That's how it gets heard. That's part of the dynamic, right? Is the inability to hear nuance on the other side, the tendency to see the other side as monolithic doxastically, and monolithically organized around only the most extreme version of the opposing view. So, to put it again in a kind of slogan, to the belief polarized person, everybody else is everybody else is an extremist, right? Good. Once you see the other people as extremists, the people with whom you disagree as extremists, and a homogeneous lot of extremists, and you become less inclined or more unable to hear the nuance in their views, you naturally become less inclined to think that they're people worth talking to, or you become more inclined to say, I've heard everything they have to say, and I know that anything that's about to come out of the opponent's mouth is something I've already dismissed or undermined or dealt with. So there's no more conversation to be had. The conversation's over now. Why? Because there's the reasonable view, my view, and then there's only extremist noise on the other side. Good. Now, that looks like it's enough to just say, okay, yeah, that's the real problem with democracy, that it undermines our ability to be able to regard our political opponents as the kinds of people who are entitled to the political power that they wield, right? That looks like it's enough to get the problem. But let me just sort of deepen the picture just a little bit further. One of the other things that happens, it seems, with belief polarization is belief polarized individuals come to ascribe political explanations to increasingly to non-political behavior on the other side. That is, to the belief polarized person, if you are somebody he sees as his opponent, more and more of what you do that's not political looks to him like it's explicable by reference to your political commitments. Of course you drink sparkling water. That's what liberals do. You shop at Whole Foods. That's what liberals do. More and more of your non-political behavior starts looking political and explicable in terms of the political rupture that exists between you, right? And what that means, or what seems to come along with that, is not only do belief polarized people come to see the opponents as not worth talking to, because it's just extremist noise, but they come to see their opponents as diseased, dirty, polluted. They come to see everything that they do as somehow bound up with or marred by their political extremism. My frequent co-author, Scott Aiken, and I give a talk around these kinds of themes that has more to do with our collaborative work on argumentation theory. And when we make this point in that talk that we both give, Scott pulls out a Trump hat and asks somebody in the academic audience to put it on his or her head. And you know what happens. People recoil from it. No, oh yeah. And we say, it's just a hat. Hey, it's just a hat. Would you put it on your head? It's just a hat, right? And people are like, I don't want to touch it. Right? It's like something diseased has been put on the table. Like somebody's vomited on the table or something. And it's just repugnant and disgusting. And nobody wants to touch it. Certainly no one will put it on his head. Although I know there was at least one person in the audience back in Copenhagen when Michael Lynch put it on his head, right, but then refused to let us take a picture of him. So, no, you can't have a photo. Like, look, I'm not going to post it. I'm not even on Facebook. No, can't. I don't want there to be photographic evidence of this, right? So, interesting phenomenon. Just a hat. but it comes to have a miasma, right? It becomes corrupted or dirty. Now again, oh, all right, that's even, it's not just purely intellectual now about, beliefs and who's worth talking to and what kinds of arguments are worth having. Now you start seeing your fellow citizens as, you pathologize them in a certain way. You come to see them as diseased or as dirty or not only as irrational and not worth talking to, but as the kind of people you don't even want to be in an elevator with. Note, I think, by the way, that on any sort of armchairy and sort of even sort of modestly nuanced view about how beliefs work and what evidence is like and all the rest, a lot of this stuff is, I think, what one might expect from the data. Good. One more dimension to this, and then I want to move on. And there's this recent finding about epistemic spillovers, what are called epistemic spillovers. This, by the way, research is done at University College London on the Affective Brain Laboratory. So it looks as if, particularly among what in the study they call political partisans, but let's just assume for our sake sort of belief polarized persons, it looks as if once belief polarization sets in, individuals are more likely to discount the testimony of experts with respect to certain non-political matters in which they are expert, right? Discount the expert once you find out that the expert has a different political allegiance from yours. And, correspondingly, will trust the testimony of their political compatriots, right? Of like-minded political persons about non-political matters in which those persons are not expert over the testimony of the experts. Let me try to spell that out in a way that's a little bit less confusing. Looks like, in the States, let's say, looks like a liberal is more willing to accept the testimony on how to fix his car from a fellow liberal who's not a mechanic than from a Republican mechanic. That is to say, right, that, again, is part of this miasma thought, I think, that once you find out that the political affiliation of somebody is opposed to your own, you have to see their judgment on all matters as somehow untrustworthy, polluted, corrupt, skewed. And by the way, I just used the liberal example, it goes in the other direction. And yeah, I've given this version of this talk mentions, and people just say, oh yeah, I think I do that. I don't trust Republicans on non-political things either, right? That again, you say, well, that's just even weirder. It's not about sort of not wanting to be too close to the people who you politically disagree with. It's not about not wanting to talk to them. It's sort of like you're willing to take a hit from the point of view of the epistemic resources at your disposal for the sake of what? Political ideological purity or something? I mean, it's sort of hard to get your mind around what is driving the spillover phenomenon, but it does look like it's an epistemic loss as such, not even in the political sense. Okay, so that's the polarization dynamic. Belief polarization seems to include, or seems to involve, the increasing inability to discuss, argue, communicate effectively with people who aren't on one's political side. That also looks like it's connected to the inability to interact on non-political matters with people on the other side, and the increasing inability to access epistemic resources of non-political kinds that are made available across sort of political divisions. That all looks obviously bad news for democracy, I think, on almost anybody's view. Whatever else democracy is, it's, I think this is non-controversial, maybe it's not. It's the proposition that responsible self-government among political equals is possible, even in light of the fact that citizens will disagree about big political questions. The polarization dynamic, it looks like it threatens the ability for us to regard each other in that way. That is, it looks like it dissolves or attacks the ability to regard our political opponents as people who are in fact entitled to be sharers of political power. Or if we put it one way, the polarization dynamic looks like it dissolves whatever bases might be left in at least my democratic society for civic friendship in the Rawlsian sense. Okay, so one response that seems popular to some of these problems with polarization is to note that the dynamic I just described is bad news. The problem is people aren't interacting enough, or when they interact, it's already not in the right way. If we had the right kind of democratic engagement, the right sort of sites or venues for democratic participation and deliberation, we could counteract all of this bad stuff, and things would go better. And maybe I'm the only person in the room. I've grown increasingly suspicious of some of the rosy picture that emerges from the James Fishkin stuff, that you get people involved in these deliberation events and then presto, right? Everybody is more likely to vote and people get along and it's democracy again. I worry about some of the data about democratic politics that's gleaned from highly orchestrated and artificial events. I think there are self-selection worries and all kinds of other problems that go into drawing any large-scale conclusions about democracy from those data. One important thing to notice is that one thing that, one exception maybe, one big important political question over which it looks like there's not as much division is on the claim that, at least in the States, democracy is epistemically askew, right? Both sides in the States talk about echo chambers and silos and yes men and derp. They've got less favorable terms for these sorts of things, but it looks like across sort of the politically polarized sides in the States are all, they share the view that the epistemic situation is messed up, and they use the same terms to describe. I mean, they blame each other for the dysfunction and never themselves. But they've got a common, sort of an emerging lingua franca for discussing or identifying the epistemic dysfunction. Okay, a natural thought to be had is the Dewey Adams thought. The cure for the ills of democracy is more, and then Dewey adds better, democracy. Many theorists, I think, intuitively think this to be the case, that if we just fix the ways in which people interact politically, democracy would be repaired. I think there's a reason to worry about that, though. The reason why I'm worried about that sort of more democracy or better democracy thought is just to appeal to a distinction that's familiar to the epistemologists in the room. Belief acquisition and belief revision are different. The norms and responsibilities attaching to those two practices are different. Similarly, it seems to me that preventing belief polarization is different from depolarizing. Right? It looks to me like a good strategy for preventing polarization, right, might have to do with these sort of Deweyan deliberative democratic interventions about expanding the spectrum of opinion in the popular discussion, ensuring that individuals find it increasingly more difficult to silo into their epistemic bubbles. Dewey himself, thought that privatized media, the private ownership of newspapers is what he talked about, but privatized media was a big problem for democracy. He was right about that. All of those seem like responsible, good plans for preventing polarization. Depolarizing looks to me like it's a different ball. It's a different game. It's a different task. And we've got reason to believe now that once belief polarization has set in, at least to some particular degree, it's not clear what degree, but once you're dealing with belief polarized people, exposure to the other side entrenches the polarization. It doesn't depolarize, it makes things worse. There's a Pew study that has to do with this, that people who believe that the country is polarized then have interactions with people who are on the politically other side from them, and then they're polled again, and they're like, wow, we're more polarized than I thought, was the Pew result. There was this other result that, this other study that recently came out, that, I think it came out of Duke actually, that incentivized political partisans for a for a significant period of time to not only follow but read the social media feeds from moderate sites on the politically opposed side. So conservatives were incentivized and they were checked. They were supposed to not only follow but read the tweets and Facebook posts from pretty middle of the road liberal reporters. And similarly for liberal partisans were asked to, and they were checked and paid, I think was the incentive actually, to follow conservative social media feeds. And the result was an entrenching of the sense of difference, right? Wow, not better understanding, right? But I disagree with those. Those people are worse than I thought, right? They're even more unlike me than I realized, seems to be the result. And again, maybe that shouldn't be surprising that depolarization is just a different ball of wax, right? From preventing polarization. Okay. Now here's the more speculative part that I'm going to need some help on. This is the part where I'm going to try to make something sound non-heretical that will sound heretical. I'm thinking that the right response to the polarization dynamic, as we've just set it out, is not more democratic engagement, but more engagement that is not political at all. Now, already I can sense sort of skeptical hackles being raised at this point. What could engagement that's not political look like? Let me just spell out a little bit of the story that I have in mind, and then wrap up. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Not only in the States, but especially in the States, metrics of various kinds suggest, and metrics of various kinds that we've known about in some form or another for a few decades now, suggests that our civic and social spaces, civil society as such, we might say, are both becoming increasingly politically homogeneous and increasingly seen as political spaces. So let me spell out what that means. In the States, Starbucks coffee skews liberal. Dunkin' Donuts coffee skews conservative. We've got in the States two big chains of bulk grocery store. One is called Costco, and the other one is called Sam's Club. Sam's Club is operated by the same people who operate Walmart. If you are a member of Sam's Club, chances are you vote conservative. If you go to Costco, you skew liberal. If if you drive a Ford pickup truck in the States, chances are you vote conservative. That is, it looks as if non-political aspects of our social lives, non-political, in a certain sense of non-political spaces, are sorted in political ways. So that increasingly it's the case that unplanned, casual social encounters with strangers, online at the coffee shop, at the grocery store. Grocery stores is a whole other story. Grocery stores skew in really interesting ways politically, and not only about the sort of the organic shops. The organic shops skew liberal, of course. Whole Foods in the States skews liberal, but not only in that sense. Even in Nashville, Kroger versus anything else skews. Okay, that means that unplanned, casual social interactions are increasingly likely to put you in contact only with people who share roughly your political profile. And in the States, but not only in the States, those behaviors, consumer behaviors, perhaps first and foremost, but not only consumer behaviors, have become ways of expressing or manifesting one's political commitments, right? There's a reason why at Whole Foods you can, for a very low price, buy a tote bag that says in big letters, Whole Foods on it, right? Which you are incentivized to use when you're doing your shopping. It's a good thing, right? If you go on Vanderbilt's campus, lots of people are using them as book bags. Why? They want other people to know where they shop. Good, right? And there are all kinds of good, like sort of commercial-oriented or marketing-oriented reasons why this is the case. But the Ford truck is another one, I think. It's an expression of one's political identity rather than merely a consumer choice that is advertised in a certain way. The advertising is always sort of pitched towards a certain kind of male with a certain kind of set of values and a certain set of occupations. That's all explicable with market sort of thinking, but it becomes the expression of the identity. Shopping malls, how frequent, the last time you've been to a public park seems to be indicative of political affiliation. Public parks are in most, leaving aside some big cities where it's hard to get sort of any real trend because of just the inherent heterogeneity of the city. In Nashville, public parks, the people who use the public parks are liberals. Places of worship. Churches are, especially in the South, churches are now almost always overtly politically affiliated in ways that I think, just as an aside, really challenge the rationale about the tax-exempt status that they have in the States. Music venues, music styles of popular music, community centers, workplaces. I take it this is something that Liz knows a whole lot about. Workplaces are now more politically homogeneous than they were, right? That is, professions are more politically homogeneous than they were. Someone was telling me about some result where your foot doctor, likely to be liberal. Your foot surgeon, likely to be conservative. That has more to do with, I think, surgeons and other kinds of medical professionals. But interesting, right? There's interesting data about dentists and all kinds of things. So it used to be, by the way, that workplaces were one part of civil society, or one part of sort of our social experience where the guy next to you, doing a job just like you, doing a job that is as good a job as you're doing, a responsible guy, a guy you like, a guy you have lunch with, and you might not know his political affiliation after many years of working alongside him, or you might, and it just doesn't really matter. He's a good guy. It looks like now our workplaces are no longer those kinds of sites where cross interactions, humanizing interactions, moderating interactions across political divides happen. So our everyday interactions, it looks like, because of these sorting aspects, that it's not a conspiracy theory, at least I don't think it is, right? There are sort of market-based explanations of why this sorting happens. A more demographically alike group that's got its attention fixed on a particular direction is an easier group to advertise to in particular ways with particular strategies. You don't have to be Noam Chomsky to see how sort of this stuff works, right? But it looks as if our social spaces are becoming more and more sites where the polarization phenomenon is being encouraged and enacted and set in motion. So the thought is that one mode of response to the problem of polarization is to see that problem as stemming from something that I'll call sort of the political saturation of social space. And my speculation is that the calls to our political or democratic political allegiances and loyalties and profiles and platforms in ordinary social interactions and spaces in which those interactions occur has crowded out of those spaces opportunities and the kinds of experiences where citizens can build with each other the kind of social capital that doesn't have politics as its aim or as its content, but which is nonetheless necessary in order for there to be at least the beginnings of rebuilding the Rawlsian idea of civic friendship. It's increasingly difficult to find spaces that are not already conditioned by the travails and affiliations and contests within contemporary democratic politics. Now, it seems to me that if we want to treat each other as fellow democratic citizens, as equals that are entitled to the share of political power that each of us has, we need to preserve the capacity to see each other as more than just citizens, to see each other as equal sharers in political power, entitled to that equal political power, but also as persons living lives that manifest value, the value of the projects, ambitions, and aspirations to which those lives are devoted, when that value is itself not political, when that value is itself, those projects themselves have some other character. That is, it seems to me that in order to do democracy well, we need to preserve, or maybe by this point, carve out social spaces where we can do things together that are not already conditioned by, maybe infected with our political allegiances. We need to figure out ways to engage in cooperative social activities together, where it's not that we suppress our political differences or reach across the aisle. We need to find ways to interact together where our political affiliations simply are at a place, where our political affiliations and loyalties are beside the point of what we're doing. Now, what that would look like, or what kind of activity I have in mind, is a hard question. And I think it's interesting that it's hard, right? I think it's interesting that, I give this kind of talk to philosophical and audiences in political science. Instantly, almost always the first question is, everything we do together is political. What are you talking about? And that, at least to my ears, sounds like an expression of the problem rather than the counterexample, right? And so, in an early version of this kind of talk I gave once, somebody pressed me for an example. I said, oh, look, I don't know. The problem is that the social world is already saturated in this way. That's why it's hard to get our mind around cooperative social endeavors that are not already likely to just put us next to the guy who's just like us. That's the problem, right? It's sort of hard to think of an example. It's like, well, can't you just give me one example of what you're talking about? I said, well, I don't know, cleaning up a park. The response was, that's liberal. I gave a really condensed version of some of these thoughts a month ago at a TED event in Nashville. I'm going to tell you, this is hilarious, actually. I'll share the link when it comes out. You can watch the video. 18 minutes, right? And afterwards, there were 3,000 people at this thing. Afterwards, people were coming up to me and saying various things, a lot of which was very nice and all the rest. A gentleman walks up to me, an older gentleman, and says, I just want you to know I agree with everything you said. I said, oh, that's very nice, thank you. What's your name? He told me his name. He said, I thought I was going to have to fight you. He said, you thought you were going to have to fight me? I said, why? He said, well, I saw the title of your talk, which was Putting Politics in Its Place. And then I saw that you were a professor of philosophy, and I figured you were a Democrat. I said, so you liked the talk then? You agreed with the talk? Like, that's the problem, right? That was the problem, that there's already, the social interaction is already seen through or experienced through a lens that has already ascribed to the person you're going to interact with just for a lecture. It wasn't even partisan in this, certainly as partisan than this talk was, right? It's already seen through a lens. So the thought is that we've lost something, I think. And maybe we've lost something that's important to democracy, and maybe some of our enthusiasm for democracy is maybe partly to blame for this, right? Maybe some of the more is always better, participation is always a good thing, get out, have your voice, sound off. Maybe it's due to some of the developments with social media. It's sort of come around, I think, to bite us. That maybe we've experienced sort of a hyper drive to be political in a way that's crowded out of social spaces other kinds of goods. And if the idea that there might be other kinds of goods that could be crowded out by more exaggerated, perhaps, or punctuated, maybe more neutrally, democratic ambition sounds strange to you, is it strange to have the thought, I've, again, said this in certain philosophical talks, and people have looked at me strange, said, isn't politics for something? That is, isn't it one of the reasons why maybe democracy is intrinsically good, maybe it's merely instrumentally good, maybe it's instrumentally good but there's no mere about it, right? But maybe democracy, even if it is more than instrumentally good, maybe it's good, it has a good also because it serves other goods. Maybe part of its importance is, it's really important to do democracy right so that we can manifest other kinds of goods in our lives. What are those other kinds of goods? Maybe they're goods that aren't political at all. Maybe there are social goods that don't have to do with furthering democracy. Maybe part of what makes democracy so important is that once we get the political and the certain aspects of the social world right so that we can live together more as social equals, maybe that whole project is important so that as social equals we can devote our lives to other things that are of value. Friendships and loves and ambitions and art and stuff that has politics as or has justice and equality and the political goods as its necessary backdrop, but those projects themselves aren't devoted to those things. If that doesn't sound like a crazy idea, then maybe we just need to think, well, yeah, democratic politics, as great a good as democracy is, it has a place. And if democracy gets expanded out of its place, it starts to push out, this is a metaphor that's familiar to value theorists in the room, it starts to push out other kinds of things that are good and distort those goods, and to make those goods unavailable to us. I worry that that's what our sort of democracy, our sort of hyper interest in democracy has done. And the thought is that, and I'm not sure what the right examples are, maybe you can help. The thought is that in order to do democracy well, which is really, really important, I'm not denying that, that's why I'm not Jason Brennan, because this is you have to put politics in its place for better democracy. That's where we'll end. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome back for our second talk, which will be by Catherine Elgin from Harvard. The format will be slightly different. We'll have a 45-minute talk and then 10 minutes of comments by Jonathan Jenkins Ichikawa, and then a quick response to Catherine, and then we'll have a general discussion. So I'd like to welcome Catherine Elgin, who can speak about Deweyan democratic deliberation.
Thank you. And of course, thank you for inviting me. My interest here is, as I said in the comment I made earlier, about epistemology per se, and in particular about what I'm, the kind of the epistemic norms for communities of inquiry. So it's not really about democracy writ large. I'll start out with a little bit about that, starting out talking about Dewey, which is a very nice follow-up on what you were doing, because I particularly loved I love your talk, but I love the beginning of your talk, because it seems to me to be raising some very interesting textured issues about how we might think about democratic deliberation in a way that could be more fruitful than the way deliberation in a variety of democratic or quasi-democratic settings goes on now. And so this I should say this is an ideal theory. I am not saying that this goes on altogether anywhere, but I am hoping that at least if I'm right, the closer a community of inquiry could come to approximating this, the better its deliberations would be from a purely epistemic point of view. So, anyway, that's the kind of running start background here. Okay, to begin with this. Communities of inquiry are not simply collections of Cartesian egos who happen to find themselves in the same coffee shop. Epistemic interdependence runs deep. This raises a couple of questions. What sorts of contours are politically appropriate for viable communities of inquiry? What sort of political arrangements foster epistemic effectiveness where there's a division of cognitive labor? I should add, by the way, I'm interested in the generation of understanding more than the generation of knowledge, and that may or may not make some difference, but I should put that card on the table as well. I'm going to only address part of these issues here. I want to sketch a conception of democratic deliberation that I find in Dewey's work. I'll urge it provides a model for the political dimension of deliberations within epistemically viable communities of inquiry. I will not address the question whether it provides a good model for a democratic state, because I think states are much bigger and more variegated in their cognitive aspirations, so the issue might be more complicated there. I don't claim that this actually happens in real life, but I am going to say that it would be a nice idea if it did, and to some extent, something in this neighborhood does happen. So begin. High school debate teams have a lot to answer for. They promote the idea that when opinions diverge, you should double down and argue relentlessly for whichever side you happen to be on. And this is particularly unfortunate because many politicians cut their teeth on debate teams and then went on to law school where their adversarial skills were honed. Well, besides being rather unpleasant, this attitude, I want to argue, is epistemically costly. It deprives us of insights that we might access, blinds us to available alternatives, unduly and unnecessarily restricts our epistemic range. Dewey adopts a different stance. Here I'm going to explicate Dewey's conception of democratic deliberation and show how it enables us to glean epistemic advantages that the adversarial approach to disagreement blocks. Standardly, I suppose, we think of democracy as a form of government, one where the government rules by the consent of the governed, where the will of the majority settles most issues, where voting is the mechanism for making political decisions. Dewey does not deny that the democracies have these features, but he considers democracy more than a form of government. For Dewey, democracy is mainly a way of life. It's a form of association with others, an orientation towards our joint enterprises and our common and sometimes divergent aims, to our whole social life. The model for democracy for Dewey is not the United States Senate. It's a New England town meeting. A town meeting is a direct democracy. It's a form of government that was common in 19th century rural New England and still occasionally exists in vestigial form. Under such a government, the adult residents of a town meet together to decide what the town should do. All are eligible to participate and have both a right and duty to take part. All are, from a political point of view, free and equal. They're free to advocate for any course of action they favor, entitled to be heard, and have an equal say in what is done and how it is done. I'll have more to say about this later. The background assumptions are first, there are problems that the town needs collectively to solve. Deliberations in a town meeting are practical. They concern what to do. perhaps about schools, taxes, roads, law enforcement, or public health. Second, not everybody agrees about what to do. People have different opinions about the desirability of different ends or the relative importance of these ends, the effectiveness and efficiency of different means to achieve the ends, and so forth. But direct democracy is not peculiar to 19th century New England. Nelson Mandela describes similar meetings at the great court of the Xhosa tribe, which he attended as a boy. He says, everyone who wanted to speak did so. It was democracy in its purest form. There may have been a hierarchy of importance among the speakers, but everyone was heard, chief and subject, warrior and medicine man, shopkeeper and farmer, landowner and laborer. People spoke without interruption, and meetings lasted for many hours. The foundation of self-government was that all men were free to voice their opinions and equal in their value as citizens. Women, I'm afraid, were deemed second-class citizens. He goes on to say the meetings would continue until some kind of consensus was reached. They ended in unanimity and not at all. Unanimity, however, might be an agreement to disagree, to wait for a more propitious time to propose a solution. Democracy meant that all men were heard and a decision was taken together as a people. End of quote. Well, to get others to adopt the policy a speaker favors, he must convince them of its desirability. To do this, he should understand the points of view of his opponents. Any political operative would agree. If John knows why Mary objects to his favored course of action, he is in better position to rebut or deflect her objections. If he knows what she wants, he's in a better position to ensure that her desires do not interfere with the realization of his. This is an adversarial stance. Knowledge is power. But Dewey believes democratic deliberation is non-adversarial. Its goal is not to get other people to do what you already want. It's to reason with others to achieve the common good. Although John and Mary have antecedently formulated ideas about what the common good is, the discussion is not a winner-take-all contest to see which of their ideas will prevail. Their ideas are common fodder for deliberation. They're inputs, not fixed positions. Democratic deliberators do not argue in order to realize their own antecedently fixed objectives and to discredit or disenable those of their opponents. Their motive for informing themselves about each other's points of view is not to block, rebut, or co-opt them. Rather, if they understand one another's points of view, they learn what each other's interests and objectives are and why each thinks that those interests and objectives are worth pursuing. They thus enrich their understanding of the problem situation, the ends that might be realized, the course of action open to them. This may lead them to abandon their position or to modify it, modulating it into something that accommodates, reflects, or respects the positions of those with whom they initially disagree. They argue from initially disparate points of view to arrive at a common, mutually satisfactory solution. To perform their function, democratic deliberators must be in a suitable, that is, political sense, free and equal. Agreement among free and equal inquirers enhances the epistemic standing of a claim. Coerced disagreement does not. If deliberators are free, they can adopt any perspective they like and examine the issue from there. If they're equal, all deliberators have an equal opportunity and an equal right to make proposals, to raise objections and offer counter-proposals, and to provide reasons for them. It's not enough that members are free to venture their opinions, however. Their interlocutors must also be disposed to listen to them and take them seriously. This is a point that Helen Longino makes. Dewey and democratic deliberators do not see those who disagree with them as rivals to be bested in argument, much less as insane, but as resources whose perspectives may provide valuable insights. By appreciating one another's points of view, deliberators enrich their understanding of an issue and available ways of thinking about it. Disagreement, then, is an epistemic asset, not a liability. Entertaining a new perspective may convince an agent to adopt it. She may realize that her original assessment of the evidence or the options was short-sighted or biased. Deliberation may lead her to endorse her interlocutor's position or to adopt a conclusion that no one originally envisioned. That the evidence admits of multiple interpretations may reveal that none of the alternatives currently on the table is adequate and may point to a different solution. By accessing the opinions of others and the reasons for those opinions, Deliberators augment their database. Again, Mandela provides an example. In 1953, several anti-apartheid groups decided to write a freedom charter which would serve as a template for the post-apartheid constitution. They sent out an open request to all South Africans, asking them what rights they wanted included in the charter. Unsurprisingly, they got the standard list, culled from the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the UN Charter, and the like. But they also got solutions that none of them had ever heard of. And these were people who spent their whole lives on the quest for human rights. Unfortunately, Mandela doesn't identify any of the surprising requests, but he does say that they got some. The South African Constitution was written over 40 years later, and it was designed on the basis of the Freedom Charter. It contains, I'm told, the most comprehensive Bill of Rights in the world, so cruising for alternative ideas turns out to have been a good idea. Dewey and deliberations gain new information about their situation and the ways it might be fruitful to think about it. So rather than seeing those who disagree with us as opponents, we should see them as allies who, by envisioning things differently, extend their epistemic range. Diversity of opinion on Dewey's view is not an impediment to deliberation, but a resource for it. Undue deference is a vice. If a deliberator, out of deference to a colleague, fails to voice her opinions where they diverge from his, she deprives him and the rest of the community of her insights. Democratic deliberation affords access to insights and approaches that might prove beneficial, but that none of the deliberators on their own may have considered. In my description of the town meeting, I said nothing about rules and procedures. For Dewey, these, as well as substantive decisions about policy, law, theory, and practice, are not given a priori, but emerge in the course of deliberation. As we collectively deliberate about what to do, we develop shared views about what sorts of considerations rightly bear on deciding such matters and what sorts of practices foster effective deliberation. We develop second-order views about how such deliberation should be conducted. When we come to recognize that certain rules or reasons or procedures strike us as unacceptable, we collectively decide not to appeal to them, use them, or give them weight. We monitor the results of our procedures and modify our practice accordingly. If, for example, we find that one approach leads to animosity, to endless debate, or to outcomes that on reflection we consider regrettable, we revise it in hopes of doing better. Gradually, the standards of public democratic debate evolve. As we recognize that reasons it makes sense to offer are reasons our interlocutors should be expected to endorse or at least seriously entertain, and that these depend on the diversity of opinions among those we're deliberating with, that affects what choices we make. Dewey thinks that every consideration is open to debate, and questions that we had considered closed can be reopened if we have reason to do so, but no, only if we have reason to do so. So the evolution of the practice of public democratic discourse and the rules and constraints we consider it subject to are accepted for the nonce as the best we can do, as reflective of what we currently think are the best ways to deliberate about our collective lives. This is not a timid stance. There's no suggestion that the possibility of revision should make us reluctant to act. But there is a suggestion that we need to continuously monitor our previously accepted decisions for unanticipated consequences that might prompt further revisions. One needs to have a particular set of skills to avail ourselves of such resources. Very roughly, one needs to be adept at both the giving and taking of reasons. Deliberators should, Dewey says, display, quote, open-mindedness, single-mindedness, sincerity, breadth of outlook, thoroughness, and the assumption of responsibility for developing the consequences of ideas which are accepted, close quotes. These are, he maintains, at once intellectual and moral traits. We might add another virtue to Dewey's list, competence. When a deliberator ventures a proposal, she puts it forth as something worthy of acceptance, or at least of serious consideration. She ought to be able to defend it by appeal to relevant evidence or reasons. She ought to know what can be said against the proposal and have reasons why those factors are not decisive. It's not enough that she's sincere. She needs to be knowledgeable as well. If, for example, there's no evidence that what children wear affects their performance on standardized tests, she has no business advocating a change in the school's dress code on the grounds that it will improve test scores, which has been done. If she has not bothered to look up the evidence that smoking causes cancer, she has no business arguing that the town should eliminate smoking bans because the science is bogus. If she has not done her homework or does not understand the reasons for or against her proposal, she's irresponsible in venturing it. This is not to suggest that every deliberator will agree about the strength of the reasons being offered, but it is disrespectful to venture proposals that, as far as one can tell, have little or nothing going for them. And it is irresponsible to venture proposals when one recognizes that the preponderance of relevant considerations go against them unless you have a way of blocking the preponderance of relevant considerations. That's always an option. On this conception, a deliberative democracy provides a venue for fruitful disagreement. Not every disagreement is worth taking seriously. There's little to be gained by entertaining the economic views of someone convinced that space aliens are controlling the stock market. But when conscientious, competent peers who display the virtues of the Deweyan deliberators disagree, the situation is different. A restriction to the competent might seem undemocratic. After all, in the political arena, we do not restrict the vote to people who have attempted to master the issues. But, Dewey would maintain, those who vote without making such an attempt behave irresponsibly. The competence requirement is a stay against what Philip Kitcher calls the tyranny of the ignorant. Remember, I'm talking here about communities of inquiry, so maybe the tyranny of the ignorant is something we have to live with in public life, but not necessarily in lab culture. It protects the community against demands that their members devote time and energy to marshalling arguments against contentions that are not worth taking seriously. Setting acceptable requirements on competence is a tricky business, however. Competence might be measured by education, credentials, track records, public performance, or in some other way that the community countenances. Plainly, it's unacceptable to require credentials that some aspirants are formally or informally barred or strongly discouraged from obtaining, or to set irrelevant requirements on membership, or to exclude perspectives merely because they are eccentric or unpopular. Borderline cases should be settled to err on the side of inclusion. The justification for insisting on reasonable requirements is not merely to preclude epistemic injustice to current outsiders who might want to join a particular community. It's to avoid epistemically impoverishing deliberation by excluding considerations that ought to be entertained. Opinions are open to criticism and increase in warrant to the extent that they survive criticism. Thus, groupthink and undue deference to authority are epistemic impediments. Even if the consensus view is correct, there's little reason to credit it if it has not been subjected to searching criticism. As Longino emphasizes, every hypothesis is framed against background assumptions, some of them unacknowledged. She says, when background assumptions are shared by all members of a community, they acquire an invisibility that renders them unavailable for criticism. They do not become visible until individuals who do not share the community's assumptions can provide alternatives. We often don't know what we're missing until someone points it out. There is then a tension between wanting access to diverse points of view and needing not to be swamped by ideas that have no merit. Diversity of perspectives is an epistemic asset. Still, it does not seem unduly exclusionary to insist that the person display some understanding of astrophysics before the astrophysical community has an obligation to seriously entertain her views on gravitational lensing. The value of disagreement for a community of inquiry is that it can serve as a source of insight into the subject under investigation and available resources for understanding it. At the heart of Dewey's conception of democratic deliberation is a deep-seated mutual respect. Deliberators respect one another in taking one another's views seriously and in taking responsibility to ensure that the views they offer are worthy of being taken seriously. Their deliberation displays a critical reflectiveness of ends and means. The fact that a course of action accords with tradition is some point in its favor, since it indicates that that course of action has worked reasonably well in the past, or at least that one thinks it does. It has. But since deliberations need to look forward as well as back, and need to look critically on what they've previously accepted, they must consider whether circumstances have changed in such a way that what worked well in the past, or seemed to, will not work so well in the future. and perhaps whether it ever worked as well as its reputation suggests. This is not to deny that we can appeal to expertise, but if we do, we need to accompany our appeal with intersubjectively acceptable reasons for thinking that the expert is in this case trustworthy. This involves finding her both competent with respect to the issue and finding her competence relevant to the question that deliberators are asking. Intellectual humility is required as well. Deliberators must be willing to revisit previously accepted conclusions in light of their consequences and be prepared to revise or reject them if they did not turn out as well as had been hoped. If free and equal members of a community engage in Deweyan deliberation, there's no political impediment to understanding the issue that they confront. There's a lot of other hard stuff, but it's nothing political. But if consensus is the result of coercion, collusion, credibility inflation, or deflation, the situation is different. If inquirers cannot investigate an issue as they see fit, if they cannot raise objections or gain a hearing for them, if their views are given undue weight or are deprived of the weight that they're due, intersubjective agreement provides small reason to think that a conclusion is acceptable or it stands up to serious testing. Arrangements that silence certain voices or deflate their credibility can undermine the epistemic standing of the commitments that are accepted. This is something that Miranda Fricker talks a lot about, but she talks mostly about the injustice to those silenced. I'm talking about the loss to the epistemic community here. By omitting or downplaying the significance of particular perspectives, or by unduly overemphasizing others, prejudice and stubbornness can skew matters so that intersubjective agreement does not supply corroboration. If naysayers are silenced, then the fact that every speaker agrees is not a good reason to think that a contention is acceptable or a method is sound. Silencing Elizabeth Warren to prevent her from reading Coretta Scott King's words does nothing to undermine the force of her criticism. It merely blocks an avenue of epistemic access to that criticism. If the credibility of naysayers' testimony is deflated, then the fact that the balance of what is taken as support weighs heavily in favor of a hypothesis is at best a weak reason to accept it. Negative epistemic consequences do not just undermine the opinions of those who've been silenced. They affect the entire epistemic community. Without access to the discredited opinions, the community members don't know what they're missing. Moreover, the skewing of evidence that results from credibility deflation undermines the trustworthiness of what support they have, for it artificially inflates the credibility of the voices that are heard. Such a situation is epistemically unjust. We don't need to look to the United States Senate for an example. Here's a different case. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Barbara McClintock published a series of papers contending that she had discovered sequences of genetic material that changed position on the chromosome of corn. She was not taken seriously. As a result, she said, I stopped publishing detailed reports when I realized, and acutely, the extent of disinterest and lack of confidence in the conclusions I was drawing from my studies. End of quote. Historians of science disagree about whether sexism figured in the scientific community's dismissal of McClintock's finding. The other alternative is prejudice against corn, and that actually is real. They don't like research that's done on corn. Whatever the explanation, she was effectively silenced. Her discovery was not taken up again until the 1960s, when François Jacob and Jacques Monod discovered the same transposition occurring in bacteria. Plainly, the understanding of genetics was retarded by the failure to give McClintock's discoveries their due. Such epistemic injustice deprives the community of inquiry of data and skews the evidence that it has. The free and equal requirement that I'm talking about is not a claim that all deliberators are equally knowledgeable or equally intelligent, nor is it a claim that all ideas ventured in a public setting are worthy of acceptance. Some hypotheses are plainly untenable, some perspectives are obviously skewed, some methods are demonstrably unsound, some positions have already been refuted. They're promptly and rightly dismissed. Nevertheless, there must be an opportunity to venture a hypothesis and a right to have it assessed on its merits. There must be forums where criticism can be offered and an expectation that the criticisms will be answered. As Mill insists, the beliefs we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. According to a prevailing stereotype, science aims at truth. The value of the scientific method lies in its efficacy at generating truths. If so, the scientific method is valuable merely as a means. This is something Dewey denies. He very nearly holds the opposite, contending that the value of scientific findings are largely instrumental. This, of course, is not quite right either, for Dewey denies that there's a sharp distinction between ends and means. In particular, any end once achieved immediately becomes a means for pursuing further ends. So the epistemic value of an end is both intrinsic and instrumental. Consider two scientific findings described by Dan Dennett. One is the discovery of the center of the smallest sphere that can be inscribed around all the socks that Daniel Dennett has ever lost. The other is the discovery of the structure of DNA. The first is trivial, the second momentous. Even if we could rigorously establish the limits of the smallest sphere that could circumscribe Dennett's lost socks, we would not and should not care. For nothing of interest follows from or is suggested by it. Although true, our finding would be trivial. The structure of DNA, however, opens a vast, promising avenue of investigation. Once we know the structure of DNA, new questions arise and new lines of inquiry emerge. Given the structure of DNA, there's a lot more that we're in a position to find out. Although both findings are true, the discovery of DNA is vastly more important scientifically because it equips us with the resources for pursuing further scientific ends. Established findings are, according to Dewey, tools. They're things we think with, not simply things we squirrel away in our memory banks. Like a hammer, a finding equips us to do a job that we want to do. For the rest of the paper, I'll focus on science because it's particularly articulate about the shared methods, standards, and norms that guide its practices and unify its communities of inquiry. Other disciplines, such as history and sociology, function similarly. But perhaps because the interdependence seems less demanding, the shared commitments may remain tacit. So what features must a scientific finding have to be a good tool? Here's where considerations of method come into play. Science is a reflective, self-correcting practice. It devises methods, it tests them, assesses results, and revises its methods in light of the successes and failures. Science is, for Dewey, doubly experimental. Each experiment not only tests the hypothesis under investigation, it also tests the experimental design. The hypothesis that experiments of this sort will yield the information we seek. The two experiments work on different timescales. In the short run, we take the experimental design to be unproblematic, grounding our assumption in the success of previous cases, our understanding of what the experiment is attempting to do, and our well-founded reasons for thinking that the experiment will in fact yield the sort of information we seek. But in the long run, the design itself may be called into question. We may come to reject experiments of this kind as too crude, as misdirected, as failing to control for factors that need to be taken into account. Contemporary epistemologists are apt to think the value of the scientific method lies in the fact that it's reliable, or at least more reliable than anything else we've devised to investigate nature. Dewey would claim that its value lies not in the fact that at any given time the method we use is reliable, but that it is self-corrected. If we consider a schematic history of experimentation on human subjects, we can see what this means. Suppose the problem is to determine whether a new drug is effective against a particular disease. To test it in the past, physicians just gave the drug to patients suffering from the disease and noticed whether their health improved. This yielded some information, but their health might have improved anyway, since some diseases are self-limited. Improvement alone does not demonstrate that the drug is effective. To answer this worry, they introduced controlled experiments. Rather than just noting whether patients who took the drug improved, they investigated whether patients who took the drug improved more or more quickly than otherwise similar patients who served as controls. This yielded more information, but still not enough to engender a whole lot of confidence. For human beings are suggestible. Often merely thinking that one is taking an effective medication is enough to bring about improvement. To prevent being misled by a placebo effect, medical scientists then recognized that the experiments needed to be blind. They give both groups of patients pills. Some contained the experimental drug, the others were inert. Patients were not told which ones they were taking. Even this is not enough. For being deeply interested in the efficacy of the drug and not particularly interested in the course of disease in the control group, physicians participating in the experiment might be more attentive or differently attentive to patients who were getting the real drug. This might affect the rate of improvement. Some medical scientists recognized that experiments needed to be double-blind. Neither the patients nor the physicians who interacted with them should know who was taking the experimental drug. And the process continues. And notice the way it continues is by reflecting on what's already been done. It's not from some view from nowhere, a priori view of how things ought to carry on. Oh yeah, we forgot to control for that, moving right along. So rather than the methods for investigating such things being fixed in advance or grounded in pure reason, what we see is a growth of knowledge about what sorts of problems investigators face and what sorts of solutions are needed to prevent or solve those problems. As we learn about science, we learn how to learn about science, and we revise our investigatory practices and standards of acceptability in light of what we've learned. So our current methods of investigating are better than our predecessors, but we've corrected for the inadequacies we found in their practices. Over time, as we came to recognize the limitations of earlier experimental efforts, we learned the value of controlled experiments, of double-blind experiments, of rigorous statistical analyses, and so forth. This is the reflective trial and error process that we saw in the evolution of democratic rules in the town meeting. If scientific methods are not a priori requirements of right reason, why should scientists credit their deliverances? Rather than following a method mandated from above, the scientific community collectively devises the rules that bind them. In Kantian terms, they're legislating members in a commonwealth of epistemic ends. They set the standards by which their activities, results, and reasons will be judged. The methods they endorse are the ones that they believe will yield stable, fruitful results, and their collective belief is grounded in experiences that were generated by experiments designed expressly to test those beliefs. The systematicity and rigor of science provides the backing for the results. Science is a social enterprise designed and redesigned to achieve certain ends. Findings, methods, and modes of reason must be open to and responsive to responsible criticism. The community must establish canons of criticism, identifying and justifying the sorts of objections and grounds for objection it deems legitimate. That is worthy of being taken seriously. Moreover, the community must provide venues where criticisms can be offered and assessed on their merits. Again, this is from Landreneau. Science seeks to systematize, organize understanding of nature, an understanding that consists of findings stable enough that they can justifiably be built on. The standards of the scientific community represent its consensus as to the best ways to achieve such ends. They're devised and endorsed to underwrite their joint ventures, regulate their professional conduct, and assess their ends and means. A key question, obviously, is what kind of community fosters science? Not surprisingly, Dewey's answer is a community that displays the virtues of democratic deliberation. In effect, Dewey considers an ideal scientific community a democracy of the mind. Its members are free and equal. They're free in the sense that they have the liberty to pursue inquiries and advocate positions that they consider correct. They're equal in the sense that any member can advance a scientific claim, which then will be assessed on its merits, not on the basis of the power or prestige of its advocate. There's no place for arguments from authority in science. The moral/epistemic virtues of a scientist are those of a democratic deliberator. Hence, scientists must be open-minded. They must be ready, willing, and able to assess consideration on its merits. That requires not only a willingness to modify one's views in light of evidence, but an ability to understand the evidence, understand why it is evidence, and understand how much weight attaches to it. They should see the scientific community as working towards common goals and construe objections to their positions or alternatives developed by others as resources for fostering their common objectives. Their end is discovering what is the case, and to achieve that may require modulating, modifying, adjusting, or repudiating positions they originally put forth. There may be a presumption in favor of ideas that accord with established findings or that are endorsed by the giants of the field. Established findings have, after all, proven their worth under presumptively severe testing. The giants of the field have shown themselves to be excellent scientists. But such presumptions are overridable, and they must be. In the end, what is to be accepted is whatever satisfies the currently uncontroversial standards of the community, no matter how eccentric it or its advocate is. Scientists must be single-minded. They must be ready, willing, and able to focus on what is relevant, to pursue inquiries through to the end, to resist distraction and distortion, to be unswayed by political pressure or intellectual fads. They must be sincere. Endorsing a hypothesis one considers inadequately supported by the evidence is scientifically irresponsible. Fabricating results is not merely a moral failing, it's a betrayal of science. Scientists must also be honest about those aspects of their investigation that limit the scope, accuracy, or stability of their findings. Results are said to hold only within certain limits of temperature or pressure, to be accurate to only so many significant figures, to be vulnerable under changes of boundary conditions, and so forth. Scientists build on each other's findings. This is the nature of science. You start from what you think other people have established. And they can build on each other's findings with confidence only if they can be confident the results are as their adherents maintain that they are. Scientists must display breadth of outlook as well. They need to see where the small problem they're working on fits into science as a whole, how the phenomenon under investigation fits into nature as a whole. Breadth of outlook reveals both resources and constraints. The resources include the availability of methods, findings, and procedures that have shown their worth elsewhere, and the accessibility of seemingly remote facts that bear on and have the potential to illuminate a problem under discussion. Among the constraints are the recognition that the findings in one area of science should mesh with the findings in other areas. As in political democratic deliberations, breadth of outlook in science enables one to reformulate problems in ways that make them more tractable and their solutions more satisfactory, all things considered. Scientists must be thorough. They must take pains to ensure that the results have been rigorously established, that they've amassed sufficient evidence, that their investigations have controlled for all the factors that, as far as we now know, need to be controlled for. Scientists must, moreover, assume responsibility for developing the consequences of their ideas. They should pursue the fruitful lines of inquiry. They should seek to discover the structure of DNA, not Dennis' lost sock sphere. They should also conduct inquiries and present the results in such a way that opportunities emerge and are evident. Toward the end of the paper in which Watson and Crick announced the structure of DNA, they say, "It has not escaped our notice that the specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material." End of quote. They thus present the result as not only enormously interesting and important in its own right, but also as enormously interesting and important because of what it portends for further genetic inquiry. They highlight the fruitfulness of the finding. We're going to invent molecular genetics tomorrow. Basically, that's what that sentence says. Scientists must be competent. They must prefer only such work as satisfies or successfully challenges the current standards of acceptability. This requires that they be capable of recognizing those standards and the constraints the standards place on methods and findings. It requires that they be capable of working within those constraints and satisfying those standards or successfully challenging them. Since science incorporates mechanisms for challenging current findings, also methods and standards, the competence requirement is no bar to innovation. Dewey is not content for science's sake, however. He thinks that scientists should also be concerned with the broader social consequences of their ideas. Science should be a social good. So scientists need to foresee more broadly social consequences as well. If his finding is apt to be misunderstood or misused, a scientist has, on Dewey's view, an obligation to present it in a way that will prevent this from happening. He may also believe that if the foreseeable social consequences of a line of inquiry are sufficiently bleak, that line of inquiry ought not be pursued. Scientists must be fallibilists. They must be prepared to call into question what had previously been considered settled, should new evidence emerge. They must be prepared to modify their standards, methods, and procedures in light of the successes and failures of their investigations, in order to eliminate distortion, bias, and other sources of error. They must, in effect, treat even the most established finding as a working hypothesis, something acceptable for now, tentatively and provisionally, but not something so certain that it cannot be called into question. But fallibilism should not be seen as a weak-kneed failure to commit. To accept something as a working hypothesis is to be willing to use it as a tool for further inquiry. It's to be willing to work with it. Fallibilism is simply the recognition that a tool that has worked elsewhere may fail in new circumstances. So although its previously successes entitle us to some confidence, that confidence should be tempered with caution. Past science successes do not guarantee future ones. Like citizens in a democracy, the scientific community makes the rules that bind it. They set the standards for acceptability, dictating the methods, rules, and procedures that science is willing to endorse. Science is self-correcting, not only in the sense of revising its views in light of new findings, but also in light of revising its rules, procedures, and standards, in light of the successes and failures of the investigations that they sanction. When science dictates these and only these sorts of reasons count as scientific, it does so because it has found that by restricting itself to these and only these sorts of reasons, it can progress. As Dewey insists, the scientific method is grounded in experience and is justified by the products it produces. Finally, scientists must stand to one another in relations of mutual respect. They need to know that the other members of the scientific community both have and endorse the simultaneously intellectual and moral virtues that underlie science. Each scientist knows, and knows that the others know, that these standards are collectively endorsed, and each is willing to act as a scientist within the constraints that those standards dictate. This, of course, is not to deny the existence of scientific fraud, sloppiness, or other sorts of irresponsibility. It is merely to point out that the mutual recognition of shared standards is what makes such behavior scientifically irresponsible. If democracy is a way of mind, a way of life, and not just a way of mind, these virtues, which are at once cognitive and moral, should characterize our relations to one another, to our shared problems, and our common world generally. They're not peculiar to political or academic settings. Whenever we're deliberating about matters of common concern, in faculty meetings, PTA meetings, even in formal discussions on subway platforms, we should display the virtues of democratic deliberators: mutual respect, responsibility to the evidence, foresight about material and social consequences, intellectual humility, and so forth. Since according to Dewey, all deliberation is public deliberation, these virtues should infuse our lives. Thank you.
Comments from Jonathan, I think he's
Okay, short follow-up here. I guess one of my, I'll start at the end about who gets to be in the community, because this is an important question and it has to be worked out. Okay, we can say, well, the Zosha Town Council excluded women, and Mandela recognizes that this was a mistake. In fact, the town meetings in New England did not exclude any indigenous people who still lived in the town. There was past injustice that led to there not being a whole lot of them, but in, for example, Hanover, New Hampshire, there were indigenous people and they were part of the town meeting because it was everybody who lives in the town was the rule. Now, you could still worry, but the thing that I'm suggesting, that Dewey's suggesting, that isn't actually, I think, all that bad an idea, is that these are things we work out. We see when a practice strikes us as having been unjust, and we then say, we got to do something about that, and then we try something. So, and I think that this is also goes to the worries that Jonathan has at the end about the norms that enforce and favor the community's unjust power structures in the scientific case. this is what Longino is saying, that something like the free and equal requirement pulls against. That, that part of the thing that feminist philosophy of science has done is say we can identify the problems and these are some solutions to them. So I think that the worry is there, but it's not a disaster yet. Now, the worry about, the first worry about whether I don't know if this is the first worry, but the worry about whether this gets too subjective because you have to do what's best by your own lights. First of all, I don't see what else you can do. If we're trying to figure out what we're trying to do, you can say there's an objective truth we're trying to discover. But you have to realize that our epistemic situation is we don't know what it is yet. We don't know what the structure of DNA is. And we have to figure out how to figure that out. And going with what's best by our own light seems better than going with anything else, if you have openness to correction and so forth. So I think the objectivity of what we're trying to find out does not at all tell us exactly what we should do to find this out, because if you have some sort of independent criterion of objectivity, it still doesn't tell you what to do. So I think that worries about objectivity here are, you have to kind of sneak up on them a little bit. You have to, in asking about your self-correcting procedure, you have to add, or what procedure you take to be self-correcting. Do you think that this correction is likely to push us in a good direction? Without already having, the answer at the back of the book that you can go and check. So I think that whatever we think about objectivity, doing our best as far as we can tell, and doing what we think by our own lights is as good information as we've got, is the best we can do. Now, the first issue was about hoping to do a factor analysis into the epistemic and the practical. I'm not sure that can actually be done. But even if it can, I would want to say that on the epistemic side we have exactly the same problem, and that's the problem as it occurs in the scientific case. If you're trying to figure out, structure of DNA again, is it a single helix or a double helix? Opinions diverge. Here, people thought it was double. In California, they thought it was single. And then you have to ask, on the evidence, what should we think? And this is a purely theoretical question as far as I could see. So we can't say it's all going to be about fixing the roads, although it is, it's the same kind of thing. But in fact, in the scientific case, we can have the same sort of question. And if the community says, well, these are the evolving standards of acceptance, then we see that we get the same picture on the purely theoretical level as we get in the town meeting on fixing the roads. Because among the things that are going to key into my assertion, that we can't unbraid the theoretical and the epistemic and the practical as nicely as Jonathan likes, is that there's always going to be the question, how should we decide? How can we figure this out? Which becomes a practical question. And it may involve practical questions about what sorts of experiments can we do? What sorts of crystallographic models can we get? And so forth, which has to do with, material resources for detecting various things. So I think we're stuck with the kind of picture I've got, even on the purely theoretical, maybe not on the mathematical side, although I probably would even want to argue that it goes there. But when you get to empirical science, questions about what can we do, how can we intervene, what kinds of activities are going to yield the insights that we want, I think we're stuck with that all the time. Okay, stop now.
Okay, so welcome back to the second keynote lecture and the final talk of the day. We're delighted to welcome Elizabeth Anderson, who is the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy at the University of Michigan, and she's going to talk about epistemic bubbles and authoritarian politics.
Okay, so how does this thing advance? Do I go this way? Okay, I did.
You did it.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the current political moment, mostly in a U.S. context, although I think it's affecting many other electoral democracies in the world. But in the United States, the case is especially exacerbated. It's a case of what I'm calling an epistemic bubble, and that's when you have whole groups of people who believe utterly wacky and crazy things that have great political consequence. So I'm going to start off giving you the standard account of an epistemic bubble, which we can credit to Cass Sunstein. Bob already introduced us to Cass's view. And you can read any of his last 20 books and they all say the same thing, but it's a standard account, and so any of them, it's an important account. I do recommend reading it, but you don't have to read all 20 books, okay? So an epistemic bubble consists of a closed epistemic network. These are people who are only talking among themselves, of like-minded individuals. So they have similar values, similar priors that they ascribe to various factual claims. And they also tend to make common judgments about the credibility of sources of information. If you just throw in there what the cognitive scientists tell us, that all human beings are subject to cognitive biases in the uptake of evidence, then people who meet the first three conditions, the members of such groups then tend to be vulnerable to the spread of both false and extreme beliefs within their network. And importantly, what makes this an epistemic bubble is that they lack the means to correct their false beliefs within the network. How does this happen? Well, on Sunstein's view, we start off with the basic fact that we're all pervasively dependent on the testimony of others in order to get information about the wider world. So if somebody in the group injects testimony that is actually false, but which fits the common in-group priors of the group and fits their confirmation biases, you're going to get something known, first off, as an information cascade. What happens here is that the members start deferring just to the number of other group members who affirm belief in this falsehood. And they're going to start withholding contrary evidence that they might be aware of because they see the other members of the group converging on this falsehood. And secondly, we get what's known as in-group polarization. That is, as group members communicate their agreement with this belief among themselves, they increase their confidence in the belief. They increase the extremity of the belief. By extremity, I mean, take an example of discussion of the fact that Hillary Clinton was sloppy in her management of the security of State Department emails. Okay? And that it gets more and more extreme. It's like, yeah, she handed it over to foreign spies. Okay? Right? The belief just gets more and more extreme. The associated emotions also get more extreme. So from the fact that she violated a State Department rule concerning how you manage emails, now it's like the biggest outrage in the world. People are really upset about it, and then they get committed to more and more extreme action. So she's got to be locked up. Once the group attaches itself to a belief which may well be false, it's going to resist correction. One of the things we know from the cognitive psych literature, the social psych literature, is that we really are human creatures. You see idea A associated with idea B, and we forget that there's a little negation between the two of them. So here's an example of a characteristic experiment that shows this. You give people a fake newspaper article that reports a supposedly scientific study that shows that if you eat salmon, you have a lower chance of getting arthritis. Okay, and then the people are exposed to a debunking of that study. Okay, and if you quiz them immediately, they'll remember that newspaper article is false. But if you call them up on the phone 3 weeks later, and you ask them, does eating salmon reduce your risk of getting arthritis? They'll say, yeah, you know, I heard there was a connection between the two of them, right? And they forget all about the negation. Just associating two ideas makes people think somehow they're causally connected in a pretty human way. People also have confirmation biases. So if they already believe something and then you expose them to a balanced presentation of the evidence pro and con that view, they tend to favor the evidence that supports the view they already believe. There's also disconfirmation bias. If they have a very strong conviction and then they're presented with counter evidence, they're highly motivated to come up with refutations of the counter evidence. By the way, disconfirmation bias increases with increased education. It's the highly educated who show this more strongly. In addition, the in-group manifests lower trust in out-group sources that are offering counter evidence and corrections to the group belief. So it's very hard for outside sources to correct the false beliefs of the group. Here's a prediction of Sunstein's standard account. It predicts that segregated and like-minded groups should manifest symmetry in their susceptibility to false and even absurd beliefs without their ability to correct them. So if you look at American political parties, Democrats and Republicans, we do know that they are increasingly well-sorted ideologically. This is a trend that's taken over decades, and now they're very well-sorted ideologically. We also observe that the two politically members of each of the political parties tend to be geographically segregated. Republicans are overwhelmingly rural and ex-urban. Democrats overwhelmingly living in metropolitan areas, so they're not actually interacting that much in face-to-face contact because they live very far apart. They also manifest social media segregation. So Facebook friends tend to be ideologically homogeneous. Hence, Sunstein's model issues in a prediction. Given these facts, Democrats should exhibit these pathologies of epistemic bubbles to the same degree as Republicans. Very straightforward prediction from the fact that the cognitive biases that Sunstein relies on are universal, and that Democrats and Republicans both manifest the internal homogeneity features that lead to bubbles. So let's think about politically consequential bubbles. And what I'm interested in, there's all kinds of wacky beliefs out there. Okay, you have flat earth believers. For some reason, the belief in a flat earth has somehow become popular. I don't know why, but it's not really politically consequential. Okay, there are two types of belief that are politically consequential. Type 1 are scientific claims about risks. Is nuclear power dangerous? Is having a gun in the home dangerous? Okay, is vaccinating your child? Does that pose a risk of autism? Okay, those kinds of things. So among the epistemic bubbles that have arisen, that are highly politically consequential are the belief that climate change is a hoax, maybe run by China or something, or that vaccines cause autism. Then we have type 2 claims that are also politically consequential. These are claims about government, about political figures, and about identity groups, socially salient identity groups. So, for instance, among the wacky beliefs that have circulated recently in the United States is the idea that the Federal Emergency Management Agency was going to run concentration camps and stick Americans into them. That some American towns are, with high concentrations of Muslims are run under Sharia law. Doubts about whether Obama was born in the United States and about whether, maybe he's a Muslim. And coming from the left, the belief that President Bush Jr. was complicit in the 9/11 attacks. Okay, so here's my claim. I think that there actually is an asymmetry between Democrats and Republicans in their vulnerability to being trapped in epistemic bubbles. I think it's not that Democrats are immune, but that there's far more epistemic bubble trapping among Republicans than Democrats, and that this is associated with a pretty sharp asymmetry in partisan polarization. So let's keep in mind that on Sunstein's model, polarization is what Bob called belief polarization. It's about how extreme the beliefs are within the group. It's not about an intergroup kind of phenomenon. And here we can see pretty clearly the political scientists have a scale that has been very reliable. In fact, this is a measure of partisanship, liberal versus conservative. And you can see the Republicans, who are in the blue line there on top, that partisan polarization really took off very sharply in the late 1970s, and it's quite extreme. Whereas Democrats, there's a little bit of moving more extreme on the liberal side, but they're overall much less movement, whereas Republicans have become more and more extremely conservative over time. Most partisan polarization then has been driven by the Republican Party. We can also observe an asymmetry in between Democrats and Republicans in terms of what kinds of sources they tweet and retweet. So here you can see, you could array the political orientation of tweets from the left to the right, from liberal, extreme liberal to extreme conservative. And what you're finding here is that Trump supporters disproportionately retweeted the most extreme opinions on the right. You see that very tall red bar on the right hand of the chart. Whereas Clinton supporters distributed their retweets really a lot more in moderation, like the light blue. Okay, and they're just much more evenly distributed across the spectrum. There's also a fake news asymmetry. So we can take a look at Paul Horner, who created a fake news website in which one of his fake news claims was that Obama orders special revotes after the 2016 presidential election. He's going to order a new election in states that Hillary lost. Okay? Why did he do this? It's all for the money. He's not interested in politics at all. But the more clicks you get on the website, the more advertising revenue and so forth. And why was he appealing to Trump voters? On his testimony, Trump supporters don't fact check anything. Right? They're all like sharing all this stuff. Whereas his site wasn't getting any, his pro-Hillary site wasn't getting any traffic, so it's no revenue in it, so he just dropped it. Okay. Similarly, fake news purveyors from Tbilisi, Georgia had exactly the same experience. So here's one of their fake news ads from the so-called Christian Times. It's a fake newspaper. Breaking news, tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes found in an Ohio warehouse. Okay. What did they find? Again, they were trying to apply both sides of the American political spectrum, all just for the advertising revenue. And what they discovered was that the pro-Clinton fake news just went bust. Those sites weren't going anywhere, but fake news like the Christian Times, they went viral. That's where the money was, okay? And then we have a couple of social scientists who investigated Facebook shares of fake news, and what they found was that there were 30 million pro-Trump fake news shares versus 8 million pro-Clinton fake news shares on Facebook. Keep in mind here, it's quite clear that there is some susceptibility of Democrats to fake news. It's just that it's asymmetrical. There's also a leadership asymmetry in terms of the disposition of party leaders to inject falsehoods into the group. Okay, so we have, for instance, President Trump claiming that Obama founded ISIS during the campaign. Representative Trey Gowdy made a big fuss over the claim that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, ordered American troops to stand down rather than respond and rescue the diplomats who were assassinated in Benghazi. It was totally false. In fact, Gowdy's own committee, their final report, exposed the fact that it was a totally false allegation, but who even knows that? Because for months, years, he was claiming the opposite. We have Senator Ted Cruz, who gave credence to rumors in Texas that a military exercise of the Army, the Jade Helm military exercise, which was conducted when Obama was president, was going to impose martial law on Texas. Sarah Palin notoriously claimed that Obamacare involved death panels. That was named the political lie of the year by one fact-checking organization. Okay, and so my point is not that there's no lying on the Republicans, on the Democratic side. Democrats also lie, but a characteristic case of Democratic lying would be Harry Reid, when he was senator from Nevada and Democratic Senate leader, claimed that presidential candidate Mitt Romney had paid no taxes at all. Okay, it was false. He knew he was just trolling. Romney was forced to actually then publicize his tax returns, which proved that he did pay taxes, although at a lower rate than any ordinary American. And Reid immediately withdrew the claim because it's pretty clear that he just wanted to force Romney to, expose his actual tax rate. Whereas if you look at these Republican claims, endlessly repeated. As far as I know, Palin never backed down from the claim that Obamacare involved death panels. Trump, for years, only until after his election, did he withdraw the claim that Obama wasn't born in the United States and so forth. So, what can explain that asymmetry? Sunstein's model does not explain the asymmetry. And what I want to argue here for is that, as a matter of social epistemology, our social epistemology needs to get more group-oriented. Right now, a lot of social epistemology is working at the level of individual cognitive bias, and that's the way Sunstein's model goes. So then you look at how, because each individual brain is biased in certain ways when they interact, sometimes you can exacerbate these biases. And what I want to argue is that that fails to capture the fact that epistemologies can be held at the group level. Okay, and that social groups and group leaders in particular may promote different norms of information processing. And so at the group level, when they're thinking qua partisans, they are manifesting these group norms for information processing, and some groups are more epistemically functional than others. So I want to stress here that the claim here, there's many people out there who claim that Republican brains and Democratic brains, or liberal brains and conservative brains, are like fundamentally different in their individual operation. Maybe that's true, it's very hotly contested, and I'm not going there. What I want to argue is you don't have to look at the individual level to explain this partisan asymmetry. That partisan groups themselves can promulgate different epistemic norms for the uptake and processing of information. And that can lead groups to be asymmetrical in their ability to track the truth. So, in particular, it can make them differentially susceptible to uptake of false and absurd beliefs, and differentially capable of self-correction. And that can happen even if there are no significant individual level differences in the cognitive differences in the way individuals from the different groups actually process information at the individual level. It's not about their brains. Okay? Now, what explains the actual partisan polarization in America today? Okay? This is my hypothesis. Populist political parties have a vulnerable disposition that's derived from their authoritarian politics. And the Republican Party right now has become a populist party. Okay, in fact, it's been trending strongly populist at least since the Tea Party revolt of 2010. Okay, and so what we really need to understand is what is populism and what is a populist party. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you're a philosopher, like, what is populism? It's like it's not even on the map. And the reason why it isn't on the map is because populism is not an ideological position. It's not a coherent set of values or political beliefs. And that's why philosophers don't pay attention to it very much. Populism is not an ideology. It is a set of techniques for political mobilization of voters in representative democracies. And a populist party could adopt a left-wing or a right-wing ideology. Like the actual content of their policy proposals could be radically different. So for instance, Venezuela, classic left-wing populist party in control since Chavez and now Maduro, pulling all the same populist tricks in the name of some kind of socialist agenda. Viktor Orban in Hungary, right-wing populist, okay, very conservative ideology, still populist, okay, because populism has to do with the techniques, the rhetorical techniques of partisan mobilization, and not about the actual content of the ideology. So here I'm borrowing from the account of populism from Jan Werner Müller. There are many people writing about populism now, but Müller, I think, is the best. What makes a populist party a populist party? Number one, it always claims to represent the people against elites. It must do that. It's a necessary condition, but it's far from sufficient because it's very characteristic for all kinds of political parties to claim, I'm for the people and not for the elites. Okay, the really critical, distinctive feature of populist parties is that they're all anti-pluralist. Okay, and what that means is that the people are always a subset of the people, of the citizens. The real people, okay, are not all the citizens of the nation. They are a subset of the citizens. Okay. And consequently, populist political parties are always practicing a form of exclusionary identity politics. What they are giving, the message they're giving to mobilize their supporters, is that you are the real people. And everybody else in society, they're the enemies of the people. Okay? We are the only ones who count. So here's a direct quote from Trump's campaign in 2016 election. The only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything. Okay, classic populist sentiment. It's textbook.
What does this even mean?
What it means is
grammatical statements that he's made.
Very logical.
the people here, the true American people, are his supporters. White, Christian, right? So it's essential then to a populist political party, whether left or right, that it rejects the legitimacy of opposition, okay, and criticism. So competing parties are enemies of the people, the free press is enemies of the people, the independent judiciary, which typically places checks on the untrammeled majority legislation in defense of the constitutional rights of individuals. They're all enemies of the people, they're all corrupt. So now I just want to spend a little bit of time contrasting actual democracy with populism. So populism in a certain way represents a kind of primitive notion of democracy, which you can trace back to Rousseau. Even though Rousseau was thinking about direct democracy, there are certain perversions of Rousseauian thought that have been transferred to populist styles of representative democracy. Okay, so democracy here, I'm defining as government by discussion, right? The citizens are expressing their concerns, and you have techniques for enabling freedom of speech. Everybody gets to talk, express their concerns and their ideas, and discussion at some level is essential to the way the system works. Whereas the populist view is that democracy is, or the right politics is the dictatorship of the majority. So Rousseau in The Social Contract said, when people vote, when citizens vote, they're trying to guess what the will of the people is, but if they end up losing, on the losing side, they should just shut up, because empirically what we've discovered is that they were wrong, right? So there's no real room for dissent on a populist view. In democracy, the constitutive value of democracy is freedom of speech and the pluralism of opinion, legitimacy of disagreement, and also a pluralism of social identities. In every modern democracy, you have a mixed population on any number of identity dimensions, race, ethnicity, language spoken, religion, okay? Whereas populists are practicing a Schmittian politics of us versus them, right? There's us, the people, and then there's enemies of the people. Democracy essentially is committed to the legitimacy of opposition. Just because you lose an election doesn't mean you have to shut up. And hence, the freedom of the press is an essential check on untrammeled majorities. Whereas populists always define the opposition as illegitimate, corrupt, and not one of us. It's those corrupt elites. Within democracy, we take for granted that the will of the people is always discovered empirically. You count the votes, okay? And also that the will of the people, to the extent that we make sense of it, is always contingent and based on shifting majorities from election to election. It's never permanent, okay? Whereas under populism, the people are never legitimately defeated. So Trump famously said that if Hillary won, it's because there's electoral fraud, but he's happy to take a victory, right, if he wins, right? In fact, virtually all populist candidates say the same. If they lose, the silent majority somehow was suppressed. But that's not really an empirical claim. None of these claims can be empirically tested. It's a claim about who the people really are, who the real people are. Okay? Democracy here is supposed to be based on facts, on reality, evidence about what policies would work and help and make a difference. Tends to be aimed at delivering some material benefits to diverse constituencies. Populism is overwhelmingly dominated by symbolic politics, primarily aimed at marking moral boundaries. Who's pure, who's polluted, who is corrupt, who is moral, and so forth, in order to maintain or create or recreate a status hierarchy between the groups. Now, there is a difference between left-wing and right-wing populism that's important. There's a difference in the narratives they use, okay? And really what it amounts to is whether you have a two-group model or a three-group model to mobilize voters, okay? So there's a certain kind of narrative that is populist, okay? It's designed to mobilize voters by giving them a sense of what the meaning of political events is. So on the left wing, you have a two-group model. The corrupt elites are the rich, and they have betrayed the morally decent real people who are workers, the poor people. Okay, and that tends to lean towards a socialist political agenda. Whereas right-wing populists have a three-group model. The elites are corrupt. They consist of rich cosmopolitans, intellectuals, experts of various sorts. They are the ones who betrayed the morally decent people in the middle. So that the populist party tends to be middle class, usually of the dominant ethnicity and or religion. But how the elites betrayed the people is by unjustly favoring various subordinated, stigmatized, and despised groups, by favoring those lower groups over the pure, decent, middle people, right? And so depending on the populist party, the elites have unjustly favored foreigners or immigrants or blacks or Muslims or people with alternative lifestyles, maybe LGBT people or the poor, okay? And so right-wing populist parties tend to be racist and nationalist in a very narrow, bigoted sense. So now what I want to do is introduce a concept that was advanced by Margaret Gilbert, and it has to do with group belief. And what I want to argue is that groups, as such, are capable of belief, and they're also capable of manifesting epistemic norms of information processing, whole epistemologies. So here I'm just borrowing from Margaret Gilbert's analysis of what it is for a group to believe some proposition P. Okay, what is it for us to believe P? Well, it's that we adopt certain norms regarding P in group discussions, such as people can assert P without that having to be being contested within the group. P is accepted as a first premise in reasoning about further things we ought to believe or do. The group enforces norms against doubt and disputation of P. And it accepts P as a basis for group decision making. Okay? In addition, if somebody says not P, or if they say something that clearly and obviously implies not P, that person tends to be marginalized, censured, or maybe even be expelled from the group. This, of course, is clearest with the case of religious dogma, right? You dissent and you're out of there. So, what I want to argue is that groups can not only believe propositions, but they can also adopt whole epistemologies. That is, whole systems of norms for the uptake or disregard of information and for processing information in order to protect the group frames and narratives. Okay? So what's important about Gilbert's model is a group can believe P even if at the individual level there is not unanimity about P. It's just that individual members of the group, when they're functioning qua group member, are not going to openly dispute P. They're going to go along with the group's acceptance of P as a basis for deliberation and so forth. Okay? So group members then may observe norms within the group, even if they don't personally believe P. They have reservations about it. This happens all the time in group deliberation. I want to illustrate this group level epistemology with an example. And what I want to argue is that in the United States, there's spectacular amounts of, there's a lot of work being done in social epistemology these days on ignorance. How does ignorance get generated in all societies, even when there's mountains of evidence concerning the objects in question? Okay? So in the United States, there's massive amounts of anti-black racism. The empirical evidence for this is absolutely overwhelming. It's just astonishing, but yet you'll find many white people who deny that racism against blacks is a factor. In fact, if polling data shows that many whites, especially Trump supporters, believe that if anybody suffers discrimination in America, it's white people. Okay? Now, what I want to argue is that we have some evidence that ignorance, white ignorance of anti-black racism, is actually a group belief and not so much an individual belief. I'm going to show you this evidence. Social psychologist Sam Summers, working in Ann Arbor, constituted mock juries out of real jury polls drawn from Washtenaw County, where University of Michigan is. So these are people who are already prepped to be on a jury, but they weren't selected for a real jury. And he offered them money to participate in a mock jury. Okay? He constituted two types of jury. One was all white. One was one was mixed race, black and white. They were given a mock trial involving a black defendant and a white victim. In a criminal trial. And then he mic'd the room and looked at their deliberations, the jury deliberation. So what he found was, first of all, the mixed race jury was more epistemically responsible on every single dimension you could measure. They deliberated for longer, they considered more evidence, they considered counter evidence if it existed. They were much better at correcting errors in recalling evidence. They were much better at thinking about so-called missing evidence. That is, if this person was really guilty, shouldn't the prosecution have been able to enter evidence of type X, which was never entered? Okay? The all-white juries were epistemically poorer on every single dimension measured, but in particular, I want to look at race-related issues in the trial. All white juries rarely mentioned race-related issues. So these could include questions, for instance, about how accurate a white eyewitness would be in discriminating among black faces. Like, is a defendant actually accurately identified? We do know, we have massive empirical evidence that whites in America are really bad at distinguishing black faces that they don't know. Okay? And it's also another race-related issue, even more politically charged, is whether, for instance, there was racism in the process of the trial, or, say, the way the police treated the defendant, and so forth. All these race-related issues were very rarely mentioned by the all-white juries. And indeed, when a brave person did mention race-related issues, they were 100% of the time, the person was denounced for even raising the issue. The police aren't on trial. right? And there was zero uptake of the suggestion that race might have negatively affected the defendant's chance. What happened in the mixed race jury deliberations? Very different phenomena. Race-related issues were mentioned really frequently. It was salient to the group. Here's the part that I really love. Race-related issues were mentioned more often by white than by black jurors. So this is super interesting because in the standard social epistemology literature, we assume that the difference that diversity makes is that people with different experiences are going to inject different information into the group. But what Summers' experiment shows is something way more interesting than that, which is that whites got more sensitive to issues simply by deliberating with blacks in the room. Okay? And suddenly they recognize that because, and this is my interpretation, it's not Summers, but my interpretation of what's happening here is that in a jury context, all the jurors held themselves accountable to every other juror in the room. They have to justify their reasoning. And white people recognize that if you're going to justify your reasoning to a black person, you're going to have uptake of race-related issues, which are obviously of concern to them. And what this shows is that at the individual level, whites are actually perfectly knowledgeable of all kinds of racial issues in the jury. They're free to raise those issues in a mixed race jury, but they're shot down 100% of the time in an all-white jury. Okay? So, and when anybody, black or white, mentioned a race-related issue in the mixed race jury, it always got uptake. It didn't mean that everybody just believed whatever claim was made, but there was very active discussion of the issue. Okay, and so this is why I think white ignorance of anti-black racism in the United States is actually a manifestation of group belief, not individual belief. Whites have a lot more awareness as individuals about the existence and pervasiveness of anti-black racism in the United States. It's just that when they're talking to fellow whites, they're actually not all that free to enter those beliefs into discussion. They're going to get shot down because homogeneous white groups are enforcing an epistemic norm according to which we see nothing. This isn't an issue, right? Whereas in mixed race groups then are smarter. Okay, they're more aware of racial realities in the United States. So now let's apply this to populism. Apply some of these group epistemology beliefs, ideas to populism. And this will give us then a political epistemology, from social epistemology to political epistemology. My claim is that populist parties inherently promote group epistemologies that make the group vulnerable to epistemic bubbles. It's inherent to the whole rhetorical style for mobilizing voters. Who are the elites? Especially on the right wing, but on the left wing too. They're the evidence-based knowledge producers. They're the experts. They're the pointy-headed academics, right? Scientists, independent journalists, academics, the college-educated in general. All those people are corrupt. They're untrustworthy, you can't believe them. So expertise, evidence, knowledge workers, they're all just completely dismissed. It's inherent. For the right wing, despised minorities are distrusted, right? So whenever they testify to injustice like police brutality and Black Lives Matter videos, it's always dismissed out of hand, right? Populist parties also practice a very tight network closure around more internally homogeneous groups. Okay, this is really important. So if you look at the Republican Party, it's basically the party of whites. The Democratic Party It's the Rainbow Party. It's got everybody else, every other religion, race, ethnic group, whatever. Okay? And there's just a lot fewer experts in the Republican Party, far fewer knowledge workers. Okay? So they have less internal information diversity, fewer corrective resources. No wonder then the Republican Party is exhibiting greater within-group polarization, that is, extremity of views. So populist parties inherently have a tendency to form epistemic bubbles because elites within the party, that is, party leaders, are promulgating distorted norms of information processing. Okay? Now I'm going to introduce to you a second model of how populist discourse creates something very like, functionally similar to epistemic bubbles. So this is a second model. It's not a group belief model. It's an expressive discourse model. Okay? I pointed out before that populist discourse is expressive. It's not really empirical. Okay? So if the opposition wins, the election was a fraud. It's not a claim, an empirical claim about actual voter fraud. It's about who's entitled to vote. Okay? So on this second model, populist politics is trading in symbolic politics, expressive politics. Discourse is about declaring one's identity, whose side one's on, whose team one is on, who's the enemy, who are the real people, the people who count. Okay? And we can interpret a lot of populist discourse among Republicans in the last presidential election as an expressive mode. So, Build the Wall is about Mexicans and Central Americans. They're the enemies of the people. You got to keep them out. It's not at all about policy consequences. The Republicans in Congress know perfectly well that building a wall is really a stupid idea to deal for dealing with undocumented immigration. 40% of undocumented immigrants entered legally and simply overstayed their visa. Okay? There's a million reasons why a wall isn't going to help. Okay? Because it's not about policy consequences. It appeals to the people because it's telling them that they're the pure, real people. And you got to protect them against enemies, right? Lock her up, corrupt Hillary. Crooked Hillary actually was Trump's Twitter moniker for Hillary. It's not about whether Hillary actually broke any laws. It's about the fact that the claim that she's illegitimate, right? Voter fraud again. It's not really an empirical claim. They haven't been able to come up with any empirical evidence. Okay, of 3 million fraudulent votes. It's more just the idea that Democrats are illegitimate. Look at all those people of different colors and different national origins voting, right? It's illegitimate. Here's some more examples of identity expressive discourse. So on the upper left, you can see Obama's true birth certificate from Kenya. Okay, you can find all this on the internet. Oh yeah, I love the one on the bottom left here. Did you know that Obama, before he was a politician, was a gay, cocaine-addicted prostitute? Did you know that? You didn't. Or that Michelle Obama is transgender. Have you seen her biceps? And the upper right here, I think, really encapsulates what's going on with what I'm calling identity expressive discourse. We have here Obama saying, forget American values, capitalism, freedom, and Christianity. I serve myself, my Muslim brothers, terrorists, and my socialist dogma. Right, next on my agenda is reparations. Okay, now let's keep in mind that, in the 2008 election, Obama got into a lot of trouble because his Christian preacher, Jeremiah Wright, condemned America for racism, but now he's Muslim. Or what about, forget capitalism? Wasn't it Obama who voted to bail out the big banks and General Motors and all these things? Right, but the attribution of contradictory attributes doesn't matter. Okay, whether he's Christian or Muslim, whatever, socialist or capitalist, it doesn't matter, okay? Because all that this discourse is doing, it's not trying to present to you a coherent, consistent system of facts about the world. It's trying to tell you who the enemy is, who you gotta hate, okay? Who is posing a threat to you. So, on the identity expressive discourse model, asserting some proposition P can be a way of expressing one's identity rather than advancing an empirical claim that is accepted as open to testing. Okay? It's not about empirical evidence at all. It's not open to testing. It's about saying who I am, whose side I'm on, who the enemy is, who I'm against, who we're against. Right? So all these, the previous slide is just many different ways of claiming that Obama's not a real American, he's not one of us. Right? Assertions then function as shibboleths. Okay, they're not, even though they're using the superficial form of empirical discourse, the discourse is functioning really as an expression of group membership. Right? People affirm their in-group identity to other in-group members by affirming that Obama wasn't born in the United States, or at least you got doubts about whether he was. Okay? You do this to repudiate the out-group identification. Right? I'm not in his group. Okay? Here's a beautiful example of identity expressive discourse. Schaffner and Lux did an experiment after Trump's inauguration. Okay, and they just showed Trump voters side-by-side photos without any captions at all. Okay, these are actual photos on the left of Trump's inauguration and on the right of Obama's inauguration. They were taken at identical times. So it's not like the Trump voters were still assembling, okay? So these are uncaptioned photos, and all they asked of the Trump voters was, which photograph shows more people in it? Okay, it's just straightforward empirical question, right? 15% of Trump voters said that the left photo shows more people in it. Okay? So what's going on here? Now, I think it's preposterous to suppose that the people who said this are in an epistemic bubble. That's just ridiculous. Now, I think what they're doing, in other words, what they're engaged in is identity expressive discourse, rather than believing some actual false empirical falsehood. Okay? They're hijacking empirical language for expressive use. Okay, to perform another function, to express whose team they're on. Now, Schaffner and Lux have a similar interpretation, by the way, so they're not accusing Trump voters as being too stupid to count the number of people in the two photos. Okay, so what exactly is going on here? Well, I think what's happened is when you think about it, Schaffner and Lux in their experiment are actually violating a norm of discourse. It's not a strictly Gricean norm, but basically there's only a very limited context in which it's proper to ask an adult an utterly elementary factual question. So, you know, if you're going to the eye doctor because you have problems with double vision, and the doctor asks you, how many fingers do I have up? Okay, that's a diagnostic thing and it's legitimate. But, you know, otherwise, if you go up to any ordinary person, how many fingers do I have up? Right? What's the response? What? You think I'm an idiot or something? Right? And that's the norm here that I think this experiment was violating. And hence, the Trump voters were interpreting the question as an accusation. What? You think because I vote for Trump I'm some kind of idiot? Well, I'm going to repudiate that insult by standing my ground and standing up for the guy I support against you pointy-headed intellectuals who think you're going to diss me by showing me, you know, an embarrassing pair of photographs. Okay? That's what's happening. It's identity expressive. They're not asserting a claim. They're standing up for their team. Okay? So in this context, then, asserting a supposedly, purportedly empirical proposition can be a way of repudiating outgroup insult and rejecting the terms of the outgroup's play for dominance. What they're doing then is they're expressing loyalty to their in-group and distrust and hostility towards the outgroup, and that they will yield no ground in status competition between their group and the outgroup that is challenging. Okay, so the problem then with the discursive model is not that people have false beliefs, but that they've basically left empirical discourse altogether, right? Using the outward form of empirical discourse, they're actually doing something else altogether, which functionally speaking works similarly to epistemic bubbles, in a sense that you simply can't make any progress on the problems we actually face if you refuse to engage in empirical discourse at all, but hijack it for other purposes. So that then raises the deep question, okay, I think that American politics, as well as politics in other countries which have been captured by populist parties, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, India, Venezuela. There's a lot of countries that are captured by populist parties. And these parties pose a serious threat to democracy. Basically, empirically, a populist party that wins 3 elections in a row, by the 3rd election, they've dismantled all the institutions that are supposed to protect things like an independent judiciary, free press, even-handed electoral rules. It's all gone by the 3rd election, okay? An independent civil service. Okay, so we're at a state now where it becomes very important to address the pathological discourse and the epistemic bubbles that are driving a very dangerous anti-democratic form of politics. So we have to ask, well, can you pierce these populist epistemic bubbles or their discursive equivalents? Well, there are some things you can do. You can recruit in-group speakers to testify. Okay, out-group speakers are not really credible to populist parties, and sometimes in-group speakers can make some inroads. Okay? Here's another thing that can happen. The micro-politics of one-on-one or one-to-group open-hearted discussion. So I'll give you an example. So the one-on-one was basically a technique that was used for the gay rights movement. Okay, it's like individuals coming out to their families and coworkers. Incredibly emotionally powerful because these are people who've made themselves vulnerable by exposing a defect about themselves. These are people who are known and loved by, on one measure, they are actually part of an in-group, a family. Okay, although on measures of sexual orientation, an out-group. Okay. It's that open-hearted, vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable discussion actually has had very profound impact in American public opinion polling. This technique, which was deliberately adopted of coming out of the closet, produced the single most rapid change in American public opinion about gay rights. You can't find any other issue space which has produced such rapid change. So that's pretty powerful, and I think this could also be applied on a one-to-many situation. I do have a very powerful anecdote to this effect. It was published in the Washington Post, an article about a Muslim doctor in Trumptown in Minnesota. Here he is, he's Muslim. He settled in a virtually all Christian town in Minnesota, set up a successful practice, treating people's, family members. And he thought he was fully accepted in this town until the 2016 election when all the Trump signs came up and he started feeling waves of anti-Muslim hostility. After the election, he was fairly terrified on his own behalf and on behalf of his family. And so he decided he would rent out a hall and just talk about why I am a Muslim. Hundreds of people showed up. And he spoke very open-heartedly about, number one, what his religious convictions were and his religious practices. And number two, why he felt so threatened, even though he dedicated his life to taking care of Christian people and their family members. It moved him. There were tears in the audience. They all told him, wow, we had no idea. We feel really bad. You should really give this talk at all the neighboring towns. Right? It moves people. Another thing that can be done, emphasize sameness over difference. I think on the left, liberal cosmopolitans tend to revel in diversity, right? All the great restaurants, right? Conservatives tend to favor homogeneity, but it's easy to tell a pro-immigration story that stresses homogeneity. In the United States, immigrants actually serve in the United States Armed Forces at a higher rate than citizens. Think about that. That's a very appealing thing for conservatives. These are patriots. Okay? Stressing an inclusive we, not stepping down to the level of partisan attacks, piling on, call-out culture, and so forth, but rather stressing the problems that we share together, that we face together, can be very powerful. I love the example, in my slide there's actually a link to a Washington Post article on Carlos, who was the pillar of Trucktown. Here's this guy, undocumented immigrant, beloved by the community. He had set up a restaurant, employed a lot of people, great Mexican food, everybody went there. He gave free dinners and events for the firefighters and police in town. Everybody loved him, and then he gets deported because he's an undocumented immigrant. And the Trump voters are saying, well, we didn't mean Carlos. Right? We meant all those scary undocumented immigrants, right? Dan Kahan, who works a lot of these issues, I really recommend you take a look at his research program on cultural cognition. He emphasizes you have to avoid toxic memes, what he calls them. So on his model of epistemic bubbles, it's an intergroup process rather than a within-group process. It's people descending to attacks on the other group, you're evil, horrible people, or whatever. Or how many people in this inaugural photo, right? That just triggers identities and makes people dig in their heels and defend their team. Okay? And another thing, which I think is of great importance. So, although the political scientists studying populism haven't stressed this, it seems to me there's no way to explain the recent rise of populist parties without taking seriously the idea that increasing inequality is a major factor. Economic inequality. Okay? Basically, you have huge swaths of America who haven't seen a wage increase since 1975. Okay? And they see that their kids have lower economic prospects than they do. Now, there's this huge debate among the political scientists. Well, is it economics or is it racist identity politics? But the way I read Trump's messages, he's melding the two together. He's saying the reason why your economic prospects stink is because immigrants are taking away your jobs. And by the way, they're also loafing off welfare and Obamacare. Right, well, hold on. Are they working hard or are they lazy and collecting? It doesn't matter. You don't need a consistent view. All you need to know is who is screwing you over, who the enemy is, right? And so, to counteract that version of populism where you blame diminishing economic prospects on those foreigners, those others, other raced people or whatever, the other side has to stress issue spaces that include those who resent their lost economic status. And that's an argument for going full bore on an economic agenda. And indeed, a lot of those Trump voters would, if they had their second choice, would have voted for Bernie. They actually do accept a different kind of economic policies that are quite congenial to democratic politics. So that's just a few suggestions. I think there's a lot more, and I invite your contributions. Thank you.